My British Empire. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 301 Oba Bear. When he heard the name Ban the Pigslayer, the mud on the face of the young guard couldn't hide his embarrassment. Ha. This is such a good title. Ben, this suits you very well. The guards immediately burst into laughter, and the scene was extremely happy for a moment. At this time, the stupid bear who was behind Edward and the others seemed to sense the joy of the atmosphere, or his own existence was ignored, so he couldn't help roaring loudly. These two roars are indeed very attractive, but after a while, the joyous atmosphere between the scenes is gone. The guards turned pale with fright, their hands and feet were trembling, and they picked up the weapons around them in panic one by one, preparing to defend the safety of His Majesty the King. And the two girls were also completely bloodless from fright, and hurriedly pulled Edward's clothes and ran forward tremblingly. Their steps were unstable. Seeing that the guards were fully armed and nervous, Edward waved his hand lightly. "Don't worry, this is just my new pet. Don't make such a fuss." Hearing this, the guards' hearts dropped a lot when they raised it, but they still didn't put down the muskets and bows in their hands. Obviously, a behemoth of such a scale would be feared by individuals, and naturally, it's human nature. And the two maids beside him flung themselves on Edward with pale faces, and kept blaming in his ear in front of so many people. Edward generously patted the backs of the two of them, and after whispering a few words, the two of them wiped away their tears tenderly and retreated behind him. "Come here." Edward turned around and said to the stupid bear, who opened his mouth wide and drooling. The stupid bear tilted his head, as if he was remembering, and after a few seconds, he walked over slowly with his short and thick limbs. Then he raised his head and looked at Edward longingly. The saliva flowed out from the cracks between his jagged and sharp teeth, like a stream, with a steady stream. Seeing this, Edward moved helplessly, searching among the prey played by the guards. When he found a rabbit, he looked back and saw that stupid bear with its hair standing on end, its eyes wide open, its limbs straightened up slightly. He opened his mouth and roared forward. Seeing this, Edward still didn't understand that the stupid bear regarded the bloody wild boar as an enemy, so he acted vigilantly. A stupid bear is a stupid bear. Can't you tell that he can't even die anymore? Sure enough, he is so stupid when he's not good at learning. Edward shook his head. Convinced of this stupid bear, he picked up a rabbit in his left hand, walked up to the wild boar, kicked the wild boar lying on the ground vigorously with his right foot, and then said, "Come here." Stupid bear hesitated for a while, tilted his head, and walked over step by step. The speed was inversely proportional to his size. Walking up to Edward, he sniffed his nose vigorously, and then stared at it with wide eyes. He seemed to understand that what he was seeing was really a dead pig. He hurried over, opened his mouth wide, and bit the wild boar's neck with his sharp teeth. The wild boar's blood vessels ruptured on a large scale, and the blood flow became more violent. After the stupid bear finished biting it, he stood proudly on top of the wild boar, with his head up, and began to growl. Everyone could hear the triumphant cry. Seeing this, not to mention others, but the group of guards all laughed, and the original fear dissipated a lot in an instant. Edward almost covered his face and ran away. There are such shameless bears in this world. It is a shame to the royal family. Edward now regrets adopting the stupid bear. Eat it. These are all yours. Originally, Edward was going to eat some roasted wild boar, but seeing this stupid bear take a bite, who knows how many bacteria there are, so forget it. Ben, go find Luna directly later. I think you will get a satisfactory number. Edward turned his head, and said to Ben, who had a distressed face and a muddy face, "Bless you, Your Majesty." Ben immediately agreed with joy, and it was obvious that he was very satisfied while the other guards looked at him enviously. The prey was sold directly to the king, which not only saves the effort and time spent on the road, but also gets more money, which is a rare good deal. On the other side, the illegitimate son John Perrott finally regained his composure, walked over with a normal expression, and bowed to Edward. "Mr. Perrott, wait a minute, this is a lively party." Edward smiled at him, then pointed at the prey all over the ground, and said softly. Then, Edward announced loudly to the other envious guards, "Today, I will buy all the prey here at the market price. Long live His Majesty the King, my great Majesty the King." Immediately, the guards shouted excitedly, and there was an endless stream of praises, which made Edward's face soften even more. "And you, Bane, will get £100 as a reward for your bravery, immediately." The joy on Ben's face became even stronger. Edward looked directly at Bane, and continued, "And you will get a chance to go to the guards." As soon as the words fell, Edward heard a gasp. Obviously, this little act of buying people's hearts has already paid off. Next, the guards consciously picked up firewood and lit a fire. In less than half an hour, dozens of fires had already been raised, and the prey had been skewered on wooden racks and grilled back and forth. The big stupid bear on the side was eating the big wild boar weighing about 500 pounds with relish, and raised its short tail from time to time. Edward was also drunk with his self-satisfaction, and on this side, next to a large fire frame, Edward sat in the middle, Luna and Lucy were on the right, and the illegitimate son John Perrot was on the left. The four people formed a circle, and a deer leg was roasted on the fire in the middle. Luna sprinkled cumin and chili from time to time, and brushed sesame oil with a brush. Slowly, the whole camp was filled with fragrance. The other guards could only look at it enviously, but her Uncle Shrong didn't care so much, just walked over waddlingly, sniffing constantly. Its abdomen was tied with hemp rope and tied to a thick tree, but the distance between it and Edward was quite close enough for it to get close, and it seemed to know how to ask for food. It sat on the ground with its forelimbs raised, sticking out its tongue, and barked in a low voice, just like a pet dog begging for food hundreds of years later. "It's just that it's a lot bigger, Your Majesty. Your bear is quite smart." On the side, John, who was savoring the food carefully, looked at the stupid bear who came to beg for food with interest, and said softly to Edward, "In my opinion, it is smarter in eating, and other aspects." Hearing this, Edward shook his head helplessly. It was the first time he had seen such a brazen, greedy and fearful bear in his life. The more he thought about it, the more angry he became. Edward took a big bite of the barbecue in his hand, and the oil and water overflowed. At this time, the big stupid bear unconsciously swallowed and roared, and Luna and Lucy on the side seemed a little unbearable. Seeing the cute appearance of the stupid bear, they couldn't help but put the barbecue in their hands in front of it. Uncle Clumsy Bear just looked up, and then got down to work hard. It was quite fun to cooperate with its clumsy movements. Sister Luna saw such a funny scene, and immediately laughed like wind chimes. "Your Majesty, what's its name?" Seeing Lysinxie, Lucy fell in love with a clumsy pet, then turned her head and asked softly, "Is it?" Edward's head became a little dizzy when he heard the name, and he tilted his head, and a spoof name suddenly came to mind. "His name is Oba Bear." Chapter 302. Recommend talent. A barbecue dinner lasted for nearly an hour, and after the guards had worked so hard to wipe out the prey, all the people returned happily. Before leaving, our king and the illegitimate son of Henry VIII, 2 horses in front, chatted softly, "Mr. Sir, the pleasant time has passed. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what to do next?" Edward sat upright on the horseback, looked at the birds flying in the sky, opened his lips slightly, and asked, "What? What do you mean?" John Perrot's handsome face was filled with surprise and disbelief, and his eye sockets were slightly opened. "That's right, my sir. Your talents should not be wasted in this place where no one cares about it." "This is a great waste." Edward nodded and admitted clearly, "Although England seems to be peaceful and quiet at present, King Henry II of France is ambitious, and King Charles V of Spain is old and strong. Like a prostrate lion, the dangerous atmosphere is hard to hide. Only by working hard and catching up, can England surpass Spain and France and become the master of Europa. Even, take back our Normandy, take back our France." Edward took a deep breath before speaking loudly with his chest. "Of course, the most important thing is my French throne." Finally, I added silently in my heart. Such ambitious, heroic, and passionate words shocked the illegitimate child on horseback beyond his control, or in other words, shocked his heart. "His Majesty the King performed so hard, so why didn't John cooperate?" "A subordinate who can't cooperate with a leader in acting is not a good subordinate, Your Majesty. Please rest assured, I believe that under your leadership, England will definitely dominate Europe." I saw that John lowered his head slightly, with a dignified breath floating on his face, saluted Edward and complimented him loudly. "Yes, I believe it too." Hearing this, Edward turned his head, looked into his blue eyes, and replied affirmatively. A trace of astonishment flashed across John's face, and then he returned to normal. He did not expect that the young king was so confident. "John, have you ever thought that the sky in London is actually wider and more suitable for you?" "Yes, that's right. This is exactly what I've been dreaming about." As he said that, John sat on the horse and performed a simple knight salute, which can also be called a noble salute under the bright sunshine. A happy smile appeared on the young king's face, and John Perrot, who bowed his head, also raised the corners of his mouth, and his smile was so happy. This day is the first meeting between the two half-brothers. And it is also the most important moment in their fate. After that, Edward returned to London with 2 pretty maids in a carriage and hundreds of guards. As for John Perrot, he needed to prepare before coming to London to obtain his future. At this time, the Alexander Knight who went to suppress the Catholic rebellion in the southwestern part of England finally returned. Immediately afterwards, the Marquis of William hurried back to London. On the second day after Edward came back, the two came together and asked to see each other. In this regard, Edward wore formal clothes and welcomed them in the hall. Afterwards, he changed into regular clothes and met them in the study. "Your Majesty." The two waited quietly in the study, and when they saw the king coming in, they immediately bowed and bowed. After Edward took his seat, the two got up and faced the young king. "Knight Alexander, for those Catholics, your method of suppression needs to be changed. It is still too soft." First of all, Edward's gaze was set on the handsome Alexander Knight. The light formal suit on his body still couldn't conceal his handsome face. "Yes, Your Majesty. I will work hard." Knight Alexander immediately bowed his head when he heard this. "However, your suppression of Catholics was indeed quick and thorough. This credit cannot be erased." Seeing that Knight Alexander admitted his mistake, Edward changed his voice. His eyes were full of praise, and he praised it so thanks to God's blessing. Alexander didn't feel happy at all when he received the praise, but instead said cliché sternly. Edward still appreciates Knight Alexander's unfazed appearance. He works seriously and doesn't complain. He is a typical subordinate. However, the other was not so qualified. "My dear Marcus, you have done a good job. You have dealt with those mobs cleanly. There shouldn't be much left now." After Edward praised Knight Alexander, he immediately turned his attention to Marcus William, who was a little timid. "Yes, Your Majesty." Marquis William thought for a while, and then replied without hesitation, "There is not a single Kate's accomplice in the entire East England." "That's very good, my lord the Marquis." Edward just nodded slightly, but his face remained as serious as ever. "However, this can't change your previous rash behavior. Because of you, I think the militia in the whole of England has been exhausted. In a few years, not many people in the east of England will take the initiative to join the militia." Having said this, Edward was out of breath, and his tone became more and more severe. "Although it is impossible for Scotland to have any war with England in recent years, Scotland's religious reform will aggravate domestic conflicts and break out of war at any time. At this time, enough troops are needed to intervene, but the militia in East England has been abolished, and the militia in North England has been mobilized wantonly in recent years, and the source of troops has long been exhausted. In addition, Southwest England, that is to say, the 8 major regions of England, nearly half of the civilians have been unable to dispatch troops. In other words, the labor force under our King's Majesty is not enough, and we need to spend money to hire German and Italian mercenaries." The thought of spending money gave the young king a headache. His Majesty. Hearing these words, Marcus William's body could not help but tremble slightly, and his head sank further and further. Seeing a Marcus trembling in front of him, Edward couldn't help feeling a little excited, and this feeling was extremely refreshing. Just like that, Edward pursed his lips and stared at Marcus William silently. The air was silent for a few seconds before Edward continued, "However, if you were able to suppress the mob in time and catch Brother Kate, it's done, with all the merits. I will forcefully peel off this page." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Marcus William said respectfully, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. Unexpectedly, the young king is becoming more and more powerful. Marcus William thought silently. "Actually, Your Majesty, I was able to wipe out the mob led by Kate in one fell swoop. Thanks to the help of a talented person, I was able to complete your commission. I'm here today, and I also want to recommend this civil talent for you." Raising his head, Marcus William considered his situation for a while, and finally remembered his promise. He collected himself and said softly, "Oh? Really?" Edward heard the words, pretending to be surprised. In fact, he had already guessed that there was someone behind Marcus William. "I don't know. What's his name?" "Thomas Mann. His name is Thomas Mann." Chapter 303 Thomas and Number 039, London Experience. London in February was still as cold as ever, but the arrival of spring did not bring any warmth to the big city of London. Thomas Mann has a deep understanding of this. The original roads in London are full of potholes. Some are mossy floor tiles from the Roman period, some are stone slabs built by the city of London itself, and more are roads made of gravel. And since William Cecil's governance, the most prosperous area in London, that is, the area preserved in the Roman period, the roads are all piled up with stone slabs from the suburbs of London. and the width reaches 20 feet, enough for 3 carriages to run side by side past. In addition, the rest of the area was required to be cleared and expanded. Although no high-quality stone slabs were used to pave the ground, under the instructions of His Majesty the King, fired bricks were used to pave the ground. Although it doesn't look very good looking, at least it is smoother and cleaner than before, and the waterlogged water mixed with feces and urine will no longer form on rainy days. He was brought to London yesterday by Marcus William. After resting overnight, Thomas did not stay in the Marcus mansion all the time. Instead, he came to the streets of London early in the morning under the protection of a servant of His Excellency the Marquis, or under the guidance of a guide wearing a light black cloak, with a black hat on his head, matching his clean face, plus an attendant. He is a gentleman no matter what. Thomas walked step by step, looking around again, like a country bumpkin who just entered the city, full of surprises everywhere. In the morning on the wide road, the flow of people is still relatively small, so the cold wind is blowing, and a few drops of drizzle are brought along with it. If you don't wear a hat, your head will feel chilly, and if you open the umbrella, it will be troublesome. At this time, the roll of the hat is reflected. The rain fell on the hat, but disappeared in a moment. England's unique and unpredictable weather has promoted the popularity of hat culture. It can be said that if you want to know a person's status, you can directly look at his hat. The higher the hat, the higher the social status. Therefore, on the street, the shops that Thomas saw the most were clothing stores. There were all kinds of hats, and hats were the face of a man on the wide road. There were only a few people walking at this time. It looked empty, and the wind was blowing head-on, Thomas noticed. I still underestimated the coldness of London. After stomping his feet, he glanced at the newly laid stone slabs under his feet, and then at the seemingly empty road. He found that the king still had a good eye for the appointment of talents. As he continued walking, Thomas saw a middle-aged man in thin clothes who was carefully sweeping the street with a broom, and when he was bending over to clean, there was a square stone pile about 1 foot high with 3 low walls at the corner not far from him, and there were all kinds of garbage scattered inside, which looked a bit unnerving. Nausea. On the contrary, the streets are clean and tidy, which makes people feel pleasing to the eye. Although Thomas has never been to Paris, the central city of Europe, or the prosperous Florence, he has heard a lot of rumors about these two places from the mouths of businessmen. Dirty is the most common word in their mouths. However, this word has disappeared in London, which has to make Thomas sigh at this time. Beside him, suddenly passed a strange team wearing simple military uniforms, windbreakers, and daggers on their waists. Most of them were injured, either missing arms or ears. Extremely weird. As if seeing his doubts, the attendant who followed him bent slightly and whispered in his ear, "Sir, this is the inspection team of the City Management Office of the city government. It specializes in dealing with illegal shops and vendors, as well as incidents of damaging London buildings. It is also called urban management. It can be said that they are composed of those wounded veterans. Regardless of their injuries, they are full of combat effectiveness. They can be compared with the police in London. They are full of majesty." Hearing this, Thomas had doubts in his eyes again. Well, the police are the group of people who specialize in dealing with law and order situations in the City of London. They also belong to the City of London government. Their clothes are similar to theirs, except that the upper body is red and white. Seeing this appearance, the young attendant continued to explain. After listening to it, Thomas suddenly realized, and watched the inspection team called urban management leave before moving on. Suddenly, he saw a street with recessed roads. On the side of the street, there was a wooden sign with English engraved on it, which directly aroused his curiosity. Unable to bear the confusion in his heart, Thomas took a step, walked over, and took a closer look, and the attendant behind him glanced at his back, but in desperation, followed him. Thomas approached the wooden sign, about 5 feet high, and focused his eyes on it. I saw that on the wooden signboard, there was a big letter C, and below it were words, which seemed to be the place names of London, connected in a series by strange symbols, and finally formed an S shape. Looks like a lot of fun. Seeing that the master was also full of interest in this, the young attendant felt helpless, but his face was still full of smiles. "Sir, this came out of London last year. It's called a four-wheeled public carriage. Everyone only needs to put in a penny to get on the bus and ride to the stop on this wooden sign. These words are all marked as the place where the stagecoach named S passes. You can get off at any place, but you can only get off at the stop, not halfway!" At this time, a large four-wheeled carriage slowly drove over. On the carriage, a capital S was extremely eye-catching. "You mean, anyone who puts in a penny can get aboard this carriage?" Looking at the extended version of the carriage, Thomas' curiosity became more and more intense. "Yes, sir." Hearing this, The attendant nodded without hesitation. Then, let's go up and have a look. After getting what he needed, Thomas said without hesitation, and cast his eyes directly on the arriving carriage. The young attendant looked at the carriage and hesitated. Public carriages are usually taken by ordinary people and small businessmen, and an attendant like him can ride in a public carriage, but it is very inappropriate for Mr. Thomas, the guest of the Marquis, to take a public carriage. It's nothing, let's go up, I'll pay for you. As if seeing the reason for the attendant's hesitation, Thomas just smiled, and after saying a word, he quickly boarded the public carriage. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 304, A Thoughtful Scottish Noble. Turning the other way, the Marquis of William and the Knight of Alexander have both made contributions. As a king, rewards are inevitable. Knight Alexander was rewarded with a mansion and a shop in London, worth £800. The Marquis William only owned one shop, with a total value of about £500. Afterwards, the two of them thanked Edward for a while before retreating, while Edward sat in a chair alone and read a book for a while. Edward, when the young king was immersed in his alone time, a faint voice came from his ears. How could he see it in such a situation? Edward could only let go of the books in his hands, spread his hands, and looked at the door of his study. Edward shook his head helplessly, staring straight ahead, as if waiting for something. Sure enough, he was not made to wait for a long time, but within 3 seconds, the flimsy door was knocked open, and a pink-looking figure walked directly in front of Edward. With the sound of the door, I saw a pink and jade-carved lolly standing in front of the desk, wearing a pink knee-length dress, a pair of red moccasin boots on her feet, and a pair of white wool stockings on her calves. The long light red hair hangs down on her tender shoulders, and because of her anger, her small mouth mumbles, matching her blue-gray eyes. She looks extremely cute. Edward, why haven't you finished reading the book yet? Little Lolita is naturally the Queen of Scotland. Queen Mary is 9 years old this year, and her height has reached about 1.2 meters. The whole little face is round and plump, and her nutrition is very good. You promised me a few days ago, you will play with me today. Don't go back on your word. Little Lolly stared at Edward's eyes with wide eyes. She looked like a tiger catching prey. If Edward said a word wrong, there would be serious consequences. Of course, how could I go back on my word? I am the King of England. After listening for a while, Edward finally realized that it was a debt collector, and then he suddenly realized that he had promised such a thing. In short, his reaction was quite sensitive, and he immediately denied it after hearing it, his expression showing no signs of fakery. Let's go, I promised, it will definitely come true. Edward got up gently, stood up, with a look that had been prepared long ago, and looked at little Laurie sincerely and kindly. Oh, then let's go. I haven't eaten Edward's barbecue for a long time. Mary wants to eat it now. Seeing Edward's appearance without any trace of performance, little Lolly nodded, took Edward's big hand, pulled Edward, and ran quickly. Little Lolita's height just reached Edward's chest. She pulled in front, and Edward's body moved with her movements, looking extremely lazy in this way. Little Lolita pulled all the way, and Edward was so lazy all the way. Even so, little Lolita still had a happy expression on her face. She seemed to like Edward's feeling of being involved with herself very much, and she was smiling and laughing along the way, stopped every now and then, complaining like rubbed his calf, pretending to be working hard, but kept mocking and mocking Edward. Edward, hurry up, Edward. Why are you so heavy, Edward? You are so lazy. You are a lazy pig. Edward didn't say much, just smiled, followed her behind with two and walked honestly in the long corridor. Patrolling guards and maids passed by from time to time, but only the complaints and laughter of little Lolly, and Edward's repeated responses sounded. Of course, Edward kept his eyes on little Lolita, and heard her wind chime-like laughter, and he felt that his whole body calmed down, and his mood also relaxed at this moment. What kind of throne, what kind of world, all disappeared in his heart, and he no longer thought about it. So be it. Close your eyes and walk quietly. At this time, Scotland, which is thousands of miles away from London, and the Dumfries Cavally area on the border with England, are equivalent to the counties of England. It is located on the border between Scotland and England, and borders on Cumbria, England to the south. It is a vast area, ranking third in Scotland after only two Highland regions, and we know that, compared with the Scottish Highlands, The area bordering England can also be called the Lowlands. It can also be said to be the most fertile area in Scotland, with population and land at the forefront of Scotland, and because it borders England, it is also a place where Celts and Anglo-Saxons live together. The nobility is also the area with the most Scotland, and the church has the largest power. Therefore, the Ness River Moors on Dumfries Cavery County, brought countless fertile lands, and brought endless disputes, and in the capital Dumfries town, a small town with a population of more than 1,000 people, on the banks of the Ness River, stands a church. Dumfries Church is the largest church in the entire diocese. Hundreds of people come to see it every day. It is a veritable cathedral if you have to use wealth to express it. Dumfries Cathedral occupies 1/5 of the land around Dumfries town, and most of it is on the banks of the Ness River, which is very fertile land. It is said that the person in charge of the entire church, Pastor Andre, now wears a ruby ring in his hand. The ruby is the size of an eyeball, and there are 2 of the same size hidden in his closet. And in the secret room of the legendary church, there is accumulated wealth collected by the church for hundreds of years. For this, the nobles in the entire Dumfries Valley area salivated one by one, but they were limited by the power of the church and did not dare to act rashly. Instead, they wanted to put away their thoughts. But now, with the endorsement of the nobles of Edinburgh and the personal persecution of the King of England, all the nobles in Dumfries couldn't bear it anymore. Especially Edinburgh and other places began to clean up one after another, and the nobles were fed up one by one, and the nobles in Dumfries couldn't bear it anymore. At this time, the baronial mansion of Dumfries has gathered lively the nobles of the whole Dumfries, including jazz knights. There are about 25 of them, large and small. The reception hall seemed to be boiling hot water, extremely lively. "You said, Your Excellency," the Baron called us. "Do you have an idea?" At the corner, a fat middle-aged man asked the other nobles beside him with a wretched smile on his face. Chapter 305 Scottish Riots. Scotland and England, while institutionally similar, are actually very different. For example, the nobles. In England, the nobles were almost completely deprived of their personal attachment to the peasants, and the taxation and management rights in the territory, as well as judicial power, were all included in the king's command. Even building castles and owning private soldiers were restricted except for the counties and duchies directly under the royal family. The rights held by other nobles are basically shared by the local courts, 100 household districts, and various committees. That is to say, in addition to playing prestige in their own manners, and using their accumulated influence in the local area to transfer rights, if they want more rights, they can only submit to the king and take up official positions, or become a member of the House of Lords. Scotland is different. It does not have the War of the Roses in England. The nobles did not have a lot of self-mutilation, so the nobles are still entrenched in the local area, and even have their own armed forces. Hundreds of years of accumulated contacts and relationships, coupled with a large amount of land, independent farmers, and armed with their own private forces, the nobility is the biggest limit to the Scottish kingship. Therefore, facing the same huge Catholic Church, none of the nobles in Scotland were afraid of the power of the church, or afraid of tarnishing God, but instead opened their mouths one after another, aiming at the church anyway. In the eyes of these Scottish nobles, the king can sell for profit, not to mention the church around him. The voices of all kinds of discussions in the hall were endless, the decibels were extremely loud, and the nobles did not hide their opinions at all. The servants guarding the door felt that their eardrums were about to explode, which was extremely uncomfortable. However, worthy of being a noble with a long history, the Baron Dumfries family has lived in Dumfries for nearly 300 years, longer than the Stuart royal family. The nobles near the town of Dumfries could ignore the royal family, but Baron Dumfries called and ran over immediately. Scottish barons are not the same as those in England, and Scottish barons are also known as lords who enter Parliament. In other words, Scottish barons can directly enter the Scottish Parliament, while English nobles can only enter the Parliament when they are summoned by the king. From this, we can see the weight of Baron Dumfries' status. Therefore, amidst the discussions among the crowd, a slightly fat figure walked in slowly, quietly, with very little movement. But the discussing crowd suddenly calmed down, and their eyes immediately turned to Baron Dumfries, with a humble smile on his face. And he bent down. It can be seen from this that although they were talking in their mouths, their attention was always on the door, waiting for Baron Dumfries. "Your Excellency the Baron." More than 20 people greeted loudly in neat order, appearing extraordinarily imposing in the entire hall. "Everyone, relax, feel free, feel free." Baron Dumfries looked at the many lords and knights who bowed and bowed with a smile, nodded slightly, and said amiably, "For those who don't know, looking at him, he looks like an uncle next door," which is very heartwarming. But all the knights became more nervous one by one. Following the steps of the Baron, their bodies and eyes moved slowly after His Excellency the Baron sat down gently. Everyone raised their bodies slightly, straightened up, and looked directly at his fat face. 25 people came here, 3 knights, and 22 knights. The knights are all vassals of Baron Danfries, and the 3 knights are offshoots of his family. It can be said that these are his subordinates, and they all have to listen to him. To be more precise, 52 villages, 1 town, and a population of more than 10,000 in the 100 miles centered on Danfries town are all under his rule. Everyone, I called everyone to come here today because I have something to say. Baron Danfries sat on a seat full of carvings, glanced at everyone, pondered for a while, and then said as soon as everyone heard this, they immediately showed an appearance of listening, extremely serious. A few days ago, I had a discussion with Priest Hobbs regarding the peaceful reform proposal in response to Edinburgh's call. The priest completely disagreed and even threatened. This is very distressing, my lord. Doesn't Priest Hobbs know that this change is already going on in Edinburgh, and all of Scotland? As soon as Baron Danfries finished speaking, a tall, thin middle-aged man immediately came over and exclaimed, it seemed unbelievable after all. Although Baron Danfries also wanted to plunder the church's teaching property, this kind of peaceful method is still relatively rare. Compared with other places, at least something can be left. Therefore, not only him, but everyone present was very angry at Priest Hobbs' words. Priest Hobbs was, by all accounts, ignorant of good and evil, but they don't know. Isn't this blatant robbery even more excessive? But it was directly ignored by this group of nobles. Directly ignored, my lord. Edinburgh has already sent someone towards you, and the nobles in several nearby counties are dissatisfied with your delay in taking action. At this time, a gentle-looking Jas stepped forward and whispered to the Baron. Suddenly, a smile flashed across the faces of the people below, and they recovered immediately, and became expressionless again hearing these words. Baron Danfries frowned slightly. This is not good news. At the same time, a member of the nobles also went through the negotiations with the King of England in Edinburgh. Of course, Danfries knew that religious reform was not only one of the conditions for peace between Scotland and England, but also the beginning of the gluttonous feast of the Scottish nobles. Anyone violated this is the collective interest of the nobles, and he doesn't want to be that public enemy. Knight Willie, I wonder how the boys under me are doing now. After thinking for a while, weighing the pros and cons, and then looking at the expressions of everyone below, Baron Danfries made up his mind. Willie is a muscular man with several scars on his face, which seems to prove that his size is not to be judged. Your Excellency the Baron, since the English left not long ago, 200 young men have been practicing recently, and they have made great progress. They are ready for a battle. Willie took a step, looked at Baron Danfries, and said carelessly, with a confident expression on his face, my lord, I can dispatch 20 farmers and soldiers. I can also send troops. I'll take 30 farmers and soldiers too. The knights below saw His Excellency the Baron's blatant display of strength, and they all understood that the Baron was reminding them to hurry up. What's more, with all their efforts, there must be benefits waiting for them. Your Excellency the Baron cannot make it all by himself. Therefore, it is totally worth sacrificing the lives of those humble peasants for the sake of profit. One by one, the knights actively reported the number of troops they sent, and the atmosphere in the hall became lively again. After a few minutes, Baron Danfries made a count. Combined, there are a total of 1,000 farmers and soldiers, plus his 200 elite soldiers. This operation can be said to be sure at this time. A meeting was also being held in the Dumfries Cathedral. Chapter 306 Scottish Riots. Dumfries Cathedral is the largest church in Dumfries County and the wealthiest church. Hobbs is the priest of Dumfries Cathedral, and he is also known as the priest by people. The appearance of Pastor Hobbs is no different from that of priests at this time. With a Mediterranean hairstyle, a round face, and a friendly smile, he looks trustworthy. If there is any difference between him and other priests, it is that he has a pair of sharp eyes and a flat stomach. If you look at it seriously, a shrewd breath radiates from the inside out. At this time, the hall used to be a high-level gathering in the church, but at this time there are densely packed young priests standing one by one. These low-ranking priests stand intently and hold their breath, looking directly at the row of senior priests in front of them. 9 senior priests with gray beards sat on specially set seats, wearing cassocks made of high-grade linen, sitting solemnly, looking extremely serious. As a result, the atmosphere in the meeting room became more serious. To exaggerate, even the sound of a needle falling on the ground could be heard. The bright candlelight lit up the entire meeting room. In this era of darkness at night, the consumption of wealth in it was unimaginable for ordinary people. Priest Hobbs also sat solemnly in his own seat, his thick eyebrows frowned, It seemed that he was not in a very good mood. The atmosphere remained silent like this, and with the flickering of the candle lights, everyone became more and more tense as if he had thought about it. Hobbs stood up slowly, and said in a deep voice, "Everyone knows the situation in Scotland recently. The nobles from all over the place are like a mad wolf, shamelessly attacking and plundering churches everywhere. This is against the will of God. This is a blasphemy against our Lord. The great and almighty Lord will definitely punish sinners." At the end of the talk, Hobbs' voice became louder and louder, and when everyone heard this, their morale, which had been somewhat sluggish, was immediately lifted and their spirits lifted. Seeing this, Hobbs glanced at it, and then nodded. It is not up to Hobbs to use faith to boost morale. After all, the whole of Scotland is too abnormal during this period of time, or in other words, the nobles of Scotland have gone crazy. Monasteries and churches all over the world have been attacked by the nobles, and a large amount of church property and gold coins have been plundered. The original priests can only eat hard black bread, wear shabby cloth clothes, and guard the looters. An empty church, full of bitterness. Thinking of this, Hobbs shook his head immediately. He didn't want to face such a scene. "Everyone, although the Almighty Lord has been blessing and protecting us, we still need to take active actions to maintain our faith." Hobbs waved his arms and said loudly, "For God, for the Almighty, for God, for the Almighty." Just as he finished speaking, the young priests shouted loudly. Immediately, the atmosphere in the entire meeting room became lively, and a fearless momentum slowly rose. It took a while before the voice quieted down. Looking at the blushing young priests, smiles slowly formed on their faces. "My lord priest, is there any indication from Rome?" At this time, a tall and thin old man who was also a senior priest sitting on a chair looked at Hobbs and asked softly. Hearing this question, Hobbs shook his head helplessly. "Lord Blair, His Excellency the Pope of Rome sent me a letter, expressing his inability to do anything about the current situation in the Scottish diocese. After all, the distance is still too far, and the power of Rome cannot quickly support us. What's more, behind the irrational behavior of the Scottish nobles this time, the young King of England has been supporting them all the time, and the power of Rome is even more difficult to support." After Hobbs finished speaking, the others shook their heads helplessly. In such a situation, there was only one way to fight. These senior priests are really reluctant to give up their current comfortable and luxurious life. It is easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from luxury to frugality. Therefore, the senior priests, who had hoped for it before, also strengthened their faith at this time, and spoke one after another to express their support for the priest. In this way, Hobbs united most of the priests of the church, and intensive preparations began for the Dumfries Cathedral. One after another, young priests walked among the villages and manors, agitating the ignorant and ignorant farmers, and seeking the support of the country gentry who had firm beliefs. The gold coins in the church spilled out like running water, which made Hobbs very distressed. These are all his money and his future wealth. However, for everything we have now, these must be given up at the same time. Baron Danfries' orders were also taken into action, and knights and jazz came to their fiefs one after another to mobilize their forces at this time. Some neutral squires became the targets of their wooing, whether they were beliefs or interests. They were all an important bargaining chip in their wooing. Some have both sides, wantonly seek benefits, and try to stand on the side with the greatest interest. Some, on the other hand, stick to their beliefs, stand firmly on the side of the church, and are willing to give everything. And some shrewd squires were silently thinking about it, and began to place bets in batches in order to preserve the interests of the family. All of a sudden, the people of Dumfries Cavery County were in turmoil, and the sensitive people had already noticed that the disaster of war was coming at this time. Bloodblade, which has already been deployed deeply in Scotland, has already learned such information. Of course, there are many conflicts like this in Scotland at present, even bigger than this conflict. It is impossible for Bloodblade to pay attention to all of them without so much energy. However, the location of Dumfries Cavery is too sensitive. It is too close to England. Meanwhile, the leader of Bloodblade, Guy Ham, thought and analyzed carefully. He felt that this upcoming small-scale plunder was extraordinarily different. First, after more than half a year of plundering the church property, the entire Scottish nobles plundered a lot of wealth, and the church suffered heavy losses in this way. The church will definitely not let it go if it has been aggrieved for too long, and it is very likely that this incident will be used as a counterattack. Second, in this plunder, the Dumfries Cathedral has always shown a weak side on the outside, but according to Bloodblade's investigation, the strength of the Dumfries Cathedral has been underestimated. In fact, the strength of the Dumfries Cathedral even surpassed Baron Dumfries by a head. Therefore, It is very likely that the Danfries Church will win this plunder, breaking the situation that the church has been beaten. The nobles certainly don't want to see such a scene, and suppression is inevitable. The church will not be reconciled to this victory being suppressed, and will definitely resist as a result. This conflict is very likely to spread throughout Scotland. Chapter 307 The expenses of the mercenaries of the Scottish riot. Your Majesty, according to our analysis, this conflict is likely to turn into a major conflict throughout Scotland. At this time, both sides are gathering their forces for the final decisive battle. I think England must be prepared at this time. As the leader of the Dark Blade, Guy Ham came to Hampton Court Palace once in a while and reported to Edward personally. The young king watched Guy Ham's long beard being combed neatly, and his complexion changed from the previous sallow color. His slender body looked solid and powerful, giving people a mature and steady feeling. Seeing His Majesty's eyes scanning his body, Guy couldn't help standing up straight, making himself look more majestic. I see, Guy, this news is timely. Edward withdrew his scrutiny, looked at the respectful Guy Ham, and nodded, expressing his satisfaction. From now on, immediately focus Bloodblade's attention on Scotland, and closely monitor this event that may cause a full-scale conflict in Scotland, and don't let it get out of our sight. When Edward heard about this Scottish incident, let alone how upset he was having just received Knight Alexander and Marcus William, he assessed that the militia in England had reached its limit and could no longer be recruited. But, who knows, Scotland is about to have a civil war throughout Scotland, a civil war between the aristocratic group and the church. In this regard, the young king knew that this was a good opportunity to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. But if you want to stop the two injured tigers, you have to be stronger than them, otherwise you just go to deliver food. Without the free militia, you can only spend money to hire troops. Thinking that the small money that he had finally accumulated in his pocket was about to fly away, suppressing the discomfort in his heart, Edward calmly said to the leader of Bloodblade, Guy Ham, next, I will allocate a sum of money to Bloodblade. This is your special fund. As he said that, Edward's face slowly became serious. He looked directly into Guy Ham's deep eyes, and warned directly whether this money is for bribery or assassination, it must not be used for other purposes, otherwise you will understand the consequences. Seeing His Majesty the King's solemn explanation, Guy Ham's heart tightened and he agreed decisively. Yes, Your Majesty. Could it be that His Majesty the King got some gossip that someone in Bloodblade was greedy for ink? This decision affects my image before His Majesty the King. Guy thought silently in his heart. He decided that after returning, he would conduct a large-scale anti-corruption investigation on Bloodblade, and definitely find out the guy who affected his image. I promise, this money will be used where it should go. Seeing Guy Ham's assurance, Edward regained his original gentle face, and the atmosphere in the whole room suddenly became active. I think, after this time, there will probably be many people in Bloodblade who will be promoted to knights. Yes, Your Majesty. Hearing this relaxed topic, Guy Ham also smiled. As far as I know, there are several people who are about to meet the requirements. I think they must be extremely happy. Hearing Guy Ham's words, Edward suddenly felt a sour taste. Needless to say, he also knew that Guy Ham was definitely not one of them. Seeing this, Edward has no good solution. The rules are like this. If the credit cannot be achieved, if he uses his rights to forcibly promote him, the Bloodblade organization will basically be abolished. Therefore, Edward could only give him a persistent smile afterwards. After talking about the problems that had arisen from Bloodblade in the past few months, Guy Ham retreated consciously. As for the other information obtained, Bloodblade will sort it out every week and put it in his office for him to review, and this incident is very important, so he came to meet His Majesty the King in person, which can be regarded as finding a sense of existence for himself. For a close minister like him, His Majesty's trust is the guarantee of his prosperity and wealth. So it is very important to leave a good impression in the king's heart. Guy Ham slowly left the palace, got into the carriage, and thought about the scale of this anti-corruption operation, and seized some power by the way. As far as he is the leader and the palace intelligence service, his power is still too small. Emma, after Guy left, Edward whispered to the door, Yes, Your Majesty. Soon, there was the sound of the girls running, and a few seconds later, the girl came to Edward and answered with some panting. Seeing the plumpness of the girl up and down, Edward swallowed a mouthful of saliva, squinted his eyes and took a closer look. Then with a serious look, he ordered, Go and call John Carroll. I have something to see him later. John Carroll is a businessman appointed by the royal family, and he arranged for Henry VIII to borrow money from Italian businessmen, and a while ago, he followed Princess Mary to Spain. and traveled to Spain and the Mediterranean region for England's goods, which made a lot of money. Therefore, when he thought of hiring Italian and German mercenaries, Edward thought of this well-connected royal businessman. By the way, before that, you called Luna over first. Just as Emma was about to turn around and leave, Edward added one last sentence. Hearing this, the girl turned her head, looked at him inexplicably, and left quickly. This time soon, Luna, dressed in a mature attire, came in, first saluted respectfully, and then stood in front of Edward, with a pair of long legs tightly together, matched with long black socks. She looked very handsome, as sexy. Ahem. Edward glanced at her for a few moments, and then turned his eyes back to her face inadvertently. Seeing her seductive smile revealed in her seriousness, he immediately sat down and asked solemnly, "Luna, as the chief financial officer of the royal family, how much cash does the royal family still have at their disposal?" When it came to her supervisor, a trace of doubt appeared on Luna's face. She thought for a while, looked directly at Edward, weighed and said, "Your Majesty, at present, apart from those expenses, the royal family still has £80,000 left at their disposal." £80,000? Too little. When he heard £80,000, Edward was very disappointed. After suppressing the mob, the entire cost, excluding the pension, reached £60,000, and now if mercenaries are recruited, then this is a terrible figure. Luna, a war is coming. In the next month, you should try your best to help me raise funds. This is my task for you. Chapter 308. The tenderness of the Scottish explosion. His Majesty's impatient appearance made Luna startled. She expected that something important might happen. "Your Majesty, is there something going on?" Luna couldn't help but ask softly. "Yes, the situation in Scotland is a little unstable. With the current gold coins, it is impossible to support another expedition. Therefore, as the Royal Financial Director, this is an important task for you." Edward remembered that the next action could not be hidden from her, so he thought for a while, and said it without hesitation. "This." Luna covered her surprised red lips, and her eyes widened. Obviously, the news that the war was coming again was indeed surprising, and the target was again aimed at Scotland. She gently stroked her heart-beating chest with her white and tender hands, calmed down for a while, and then continued, "Your Majesty, if it really doesn't work, the major territories of the royal family still have some remaining expenses left over from last year, about £10,000. What's more, why do you keep taking money from the royal family? You can call a parliament to temporarily collect war taxes." At the end of the talk, Luna came to her senses, stared at her beautiful eyes, and pulled the distance between the two of them, until Edward saw the faint fluff on her face. She stopped and asked curiously, "Really?" Hearing this rhetorical question, Edward lowered his head and muttered softly, ignoring her pretty face, "That's right. Am I stupid? I'm too busy relying on the Parliament, but I forgot to use the Parliament to make money just like my cheap father, Henry VIII. Besides, I can still recruit those nobles directly when I go to Scotland this time. The free militia is useless, but isn't there still free nobles?" When he was thinking, the mature and steady Luna showed a smile. Her long legs were upright, her head was tilted, she quietly looked at the thinking young king, the corners of her mouth were slightly raised, and she looked extremely sweet. The side profile of His Majesty the King is so beautiful, with the breadth of a book. It is fascinating. Edward was thinking silently. Luna just looked at him like this. The bangs on her forehead slid down, covering her somewhat drunk face, and her whole person also exuded a sense of tranquility. "For one thing, I can use a certain amount of troops for free, and consume the strength of the nobles by the way. Secondly, you can also let the nobles participate in sharing the war dividends. It can also be said that you can use money to buy the nobles' troops, but the effect is very good. It can even win over the nobles. After all, the more obedient the nobles, the better." In the end, Edward thought of all the benefits, and finally felt that it would be good to take advantage of the vassal system left over from the Middle Ages. "Luna, you really gave me a good idea." Edward raised his head, faced the dazed girl, stood up, grabbed her shoulders with both hands, and said excitedly, "Yes, yes, Your Majesty." Luna looked at His Majesty the King, who was close at hand. This sudden behavior made her face suddenly rosy, or even more rosy. "Sure enough, Luna, you are really my goddess of luck." Edward looked into the girl's shy eyes and said softly, "However, it's better to have more gold coins. You still have to work hard to get some money, just in case." "Well, Your Majesty, I will work hard." Luna now seemed to be half embraced by Edward, with her head slightly lowered, trembling with a low nasal voice. Seeing this, Edward was stunned for a while, and immediately realized that he could not give up this good opportunity. He lowered his head, aimed at the red lips, and slowly moved up, and Luna also understood what was about to happen. She closed her eyes, revealing her long and curved eyelashes, quite shy. Just when there was only 1 centimeter left between the lips of the two, there was a sudden knock on the door. Seeing this, Edward had seen many scenes in TV dramas, and without hesitation speeded up the kiss. His lips tightly kissed the girl's red lips. Edward's first impression was that it was smooth and tender, and his second impression was that it was a little sweet. In this way, Edward stuck his tongue in even more aggressively, pried open the girl's trembling teeth, and tightly entwined her dodging slippery tongue immediately. Edward felt the girl in his arms tremble, and then quickly relaxed, and limp in his arms. In this way, the two kissed for about a minute before slowly separating. After the two tidied up their clothes in a tacit understanding, Edward sat upright on the seat and said solemnly, "Come in, Your Majesty, Mr. John Carroll has arrived." Emma walked in gently, looked at the upright king and Luna, with a strange look in her eyes, and then bent over to Edward and said, "Well, invite him in." Edward glanced at the big-breasted girl and said calmly, "Yes." Emma agreed softly, and stepped back slowly. "Your Majesty, that's temporarily leaving." At this time, Luna forcibly held back the shame in her heart, and said softly immediately. She followed Emma and retreated. Seeing this, Edward didn't do anything to hold back, but just smiled. Then, a bearded, stout man walked in cautiously, with a respectful attitude, first saluted Edward, and then said, "Good day, Your Majesty, Mr. Carroll. What is the current price of mercenaries in the Europa region?" At the beginning, Edward asked directly, and John Carroll lowered his head and thought for a moment, and immediately reacted, saying, "Your Majesty, at present, the average German mercenary is 5 pence a day, the Swiss mercenary is 8 pence, and the Italian mercenary is 6 pence. John Carroll stroked the beard on his chin. Although he wondered why His Majesty the King raised this question, he still said without hesitation, 5 pence a day is about 13 shillings a month, and 13,000 shillings a month for 1,000 people is £540. It is conservatively estimated that hiring 5,000 people and the cooperation of the guards and noble soldiers can barely suppress the bloody Scots, then it will cost £2,700 a month. In this way, the price is not bad. After calculating in his mind, Edward felt that the price was within his acceptable range, and a relaxed look appeared on his face. Looking at the king's expression, John Carroll slightly guessed what the young king was thinking, twitched his lips, and finally reminded him softly, "Your Majesty, if you want them to fight in England, the price will be doubled. Please prepare in advance." Oh my God! Hearing this, Edward's financial obsession tightened up. He felt that after his own fight, the treasury might be able to run away £5,400 a month, half a year. That is more than £30,000, excluding mercenaries, plus other army expenses, a conservative estimate, half a year, about £100,000. A few years ago, 1/3 of the royal family's annual income, and if there are other circumstances, if it is delayed for a few months, then the cost will increase even more. Sure enough, war is the country's largest expenditure in this era. With such a calculation, Edward felt his heart was broken. Chapter 309 Scottish Riots. "Mr. Carroll, now, I will give you £10,000. This is a deposit. You go to the German region and hire about 5,000 mercenaries and let them come to England." Edward raised his head, looked at John Carroll's beard seriously, and said, "Remember, the age of the mercenary should not exceed 30 years old. This is a hard requirement." "Oh. Follow your instructions, Your Majesty." Seeing His Majesty's serious face, John Carroll could only agree in a daze. "I can't control that much. I just need to help the king recruit mercenaries. This is my task then, Your Majesty. I will step down now." John Carroll lowered his head, exposing the bald top of his head, and said respectfully, "Well." Edward nodded lightly, and continued to add, "Remember, you only have 1 month. After 1 month, I must meet 5,000 people in London." "Yes, I understand." As he spoke, John Carroll stepped back slowly, and finally bent down near the gate and bowed deeply before turning around and leaving with a smile on his face. Edward quietly watched him leave. Of these 5,000 people, Edward actually wanted to keep most of them. The main reason is that the Parliament and the nobles can no longer tolerate him having more troops. In other words, he could no longer recruit troops in an open and honest manner, and the army he owned was suppressed to a size of more than 5,000 people. Some people say, isn't the king's power now at its greatest? Are the nobles and the Parliament at the mercy of the king? To be honest, when it comes to the nobles or the Parliament alone, the state power can settle them at will. However, if the two are combined, They can directly defeat King Quans. The nobles represent the traditional power, and the parliament represents the local gentry and gentry groups. The combination of the two is enough to overthrow any king. Therefore, when both of them were dissatisfied with the current expansion of the size of the guards, Edward consciously stopped the expansion. But if this group of mercenaries is left behind, it will be completely different. As long as they are controlled by good means, they will be the biggest blade in the king's hands. They don't have the scruples of the English, so they don't have any sympathy for the parliament and the English nobles, and they will act without any scruples after receiving instructions. And if Edward's guards are allowed to attack, those officers from the background of nobles and squires will definitely be extremely scrupulous. Moreover, the arrival of these 5,000 people can greatly reduce England's population loss. In the 16th century, population was the most important force for a country's strength. Compared with colonization, 3 million people were far from enough. Therefore, if it can reduce the loss of population, it is better to have less. For example, in the future, Portugal and the Netherlands, in the early stages of the Great Voyages, were able to control the wind and rain. In the middle stage, the disadvantage of underpopulation was fully revealed, and the huge colonies did not have enough troops to guard them. In the end, the hard-earned colonies were gradually swallowed up by other emerging countries and slowly declined. Thinking about his own plan, a smile slowly appeared on the corner of Edward's mouth. The next day, the Speaker of the Privy Council, His Excellency Pharis Alexander, came to the House of Commons and made a rigorous report on the proposal, and the Parliament suddenly became lively. My dear gentlemen, according to valid information, we have received information that a rebellion in Ireland is about to endanger the rule of the empire. In this regard, His Majesty the King has sent me, to temporarily increase the war tax to maintain the rule of the empire. Pharis Alexander used the compiled words and declared solemnly to the congressman below, as if he was reading the Bible aloud, without a trace of emotion. After the MPs under the rostrum finished listening, there was a lot of discussion. Obviously, they didn't get the news of the rebellion in Ireland, so they were skeptical about the news. Everyone, please think about it carefully. The same is true for His Majesty the King. I hope everyone will think about it more. Pharis took a deep look at the many congressmen below, and said meaningfully. Then, half an hour later, the entire motion was passed unanimously. After that, Pharis Alexander charged the Privy Council to order the Ministry of Finance to show the necessary spirit to levy war taxes. So, all of a sudden, the whole of England was wailing again. War tax, the Lord's privilege left over from the Middle Ages, once again tormented the English. And at this time, Scotland. Russell, who was originally sent to England to meet the Duke of Norfolk, was a red-haired businessman and a smart man in Scotland. Since he returned from England, he has been based on the anti-British forces in contact with Scotland, plotting how to let Scotland take control of the English. But what he didn't expect was that the nobles who hated England in the past seemed to have forgotten England's control over Scotland at this time, and instead focused on the church. In this regard, he did not give up at all, and devoted all his thoughts to the class of merchants. Sure enough, the merchants lost a market like France, and the loss was extremely heavy. They welcomed Russell and raised a lot of funds. But how could the English be driven out of Scotland without the participation of the nobles? Faced with such a situation, Russell directly chose to support the church. The Catholic Church definitely opposes the current religious reformation, and it definitely hates the Protestant Englishmen. Therefore, Russell decided to let the church defeat the nobles, thereby driving out the English. And before that, when the churches in various places were slowly plundered by the nobles, Russell finally convinced the church to believe him by virtue of his wealth and connections, stabilized the panicked church, and let them continue to maintain their strength, waiting for the right moment. Sure enough, as time passed, as soon as the incident at Dumfries Cathedral came out, Russell knew that the opportunity had come. Your Excellency, the time has come. The nobles have taken us lightly. It is time to deal them the final blow. Russell stood up abruptly, slapped the letter in his hand on the table, and said excitedly to the bishop sitting in the main seat, "Oh, Mr. Russell, this is really good news." The gray-haired bishop couldn't help but cheer up when he heard this, and said excitedly, pulling his beard. The rest of the bishops also had red eyes and were very happy. The original Archbishop of Scotland was David Beaton. He was one of the 4 major Scottish families and was also inclined towards religious reform. Therefore, the bishops from all over Scotland scattered together, and the arrival of Russell gave these bishops a backbone. And Russell, relying on his own cleverness, secretly transferred most of the church's property out, and the nobles could not find out. As a result, Russell became more and more important in the church, and finally became the think tank of the church. Seeing the happy expressions of the other bishops, Russell was satisfied for a while, and it felt so good to hold the power in his hands. We will use all our strength to help the Dumfries Cathedral resist the attack of the nobles, so as to annihilate them in one fell swoop. And then let Scotland get rid of the control of the English. Chapter 310 Scottish Riots. A month is fleeting, and for our Majesty the King, this is just a boring month in the 16th century. In the entertainment life of the nobles, besides hunting, the most important thing was the banquet. To be honest, Edward was still somewhat incompetent as a king. For example, during the period of Henry VIII, banquets were often held to connect the feelings of the nobles, and by the way, in-depth exchanges with those lovely ladies, to show the thoughtfulness and care of His Majesty the King. However, since Edward came to the throne, the number of banquets held can be counted on the fingers. Let alone the exchange of feelings. The reason why he didn't report the banquet was because he didn't want to meet those noble ladies who were covered in incense. Instead of that, why not read a book and molested the lovely secretary and maid? Secondly, he did not want to promote the further development of the luxurious life of the nobles. You must know that in England, it is also popular to work from top to bottom. The best example is the later Queen Elizabeth I. The Queen especially likes lace, skirts, hats, and even leather boots, all with lace as a result. You know, the lesbian culture soon spread throughout the world with the establishment of the British colonial empire. Therefore, if Edward, like his father, reported the banquet, the nobles would also learn from it, and the entire noble group would be corrupted in the power structure of the Tudor dynasty. The aristocrats were an important connection point between the central and local governments, and assumed the indispensable functions of local governance and military command. In other words, the king influenced the nobles, and the nobles used their influence for hundreds of years to assist the king to control the place. Therefore, nobles play the role of a blood vessel. Although without this blood vessel, they can still control the place, but the effect is much worse at present, and in the following centuries, the aristocracy has always been the ruling class and elite in England, and their degeneration will directly affect the development of England. But in this way, the effect is quite obvious. In the past few years, the participation of the entire noble class in the banquet has gradually declined. But this time, Edward had no choice but to hold a banquet, and this banquet is mainly because he wants to let these nobles send troops in the name of the king, fulfill the obligations of vassals, and go to war with him. Therefore, Our Majesty the King is standing in the center of the hall at this time, facing the densely packed nobles, holding back the timidity in his heart. He announced loudly, "Gentlemen, the Scottish region has begun to riot and unrest again, and the chaos is rampant. It threatens the interests of England in the eyes, and it is an insult to me, the joint monarch of Scotland and England. So, gentlemen, at this moment, please fulfill the promise you made under the witness of God." Edward rolled his eyes, looked at the quiet nobles below, and announced loudly, "Long live your Majesty. Go to Scotland. Let those barbarians see how powerful we are." The king's cadenced words aroused the sympathy of the nobles, and the whole hall was like oil in a hot pot for a moment, boiling up. Cheers and discussions were endless. It seemed that what His Majesty said had aroused the indignation in their hearts. Seeing such a picture, Edward nodded in satisfaction, and after stepping off the stage and talking to a few important nobles, he walked back calmly. Now is the time for the nobles. It looks like a perfect scene, but in fact these were rehearsed by Edward and the nobles in advance for this group of nobles. If there is no interest, the nobles will definitely work without effort, which will not achieve his goal of uniting the nobles and Our Majesty. The king made a promise that the nobles can share some nobles and church property in Scotland. In this way, the actions of the nobles are naturally enthusiastically supported and beneficial, and of course they are motivated to do things. This play, of course, has a purpose. Its purpose is to give London merchants the confidence to hand over the gold coins to His Majesty the King with confidence, so as to earn interest with the support of all the nobles. The confidence of the merchants has naturally increased a lot. The next day, the nobles scattered and went back to prepare to lead the army and came to meet with each other. Of course, the meeting place is still York City, a rear base for attacking Scotland at this time. Our king was not idle either. He hurried to the barracks of the guards in a carriage. Here, there are not only a full complement of guards, but also 5,000 mercenaries from afar. If the camp of the guards is a boxy rectangle, then the camp of the mercenaries is an irregular triangle. Your Majesty, I have recruited more than 5,200 people from the German region, including 153 wandering knights. When these wandering knights heard about your recruitment, they immediately signed up and said they wanted to serve you. They are also the main force of this group of mercenaries, and also my biggest gain." Edward half-lied on the spacious and comfortable carriage, and the maid Lucy beside him playfully shook the grapes near his lips. Edward looked at the girl's bright eyes, suddenly leaned forward, and immediately covered the girl's green fingers in his mouth. This made the girl shy for a while, and lightly beat his chest a few times, then continued to peel the grapes and continue to feed them. Sir John Carlyle, who was sitting near the door of the carriage, pretended not to care, and said solemnly, "Why do you work for me? I think it's because they see the possibility of obtaining a fief. This is the opportunity they dream of." Although he was flirting with the girl, Edward's ears were still listening. Regarding the picture of the group of wandering knights pretending, Edward expressed a little disgust facing His Majesty's merciless words. John Carlyle was embarrassed to criticize the person he envied, so he could only respond in silence at this time. Europa presents an illusion of peace, and those wandering knights who are planning to rely on military exploits to obtain fiefdoms, of course, are eager for this kind of recruitment from England, even if it is England, a wild island country. However, for the more than 100 knights, Edward was still salivating. In England, which had experienced the War of the Roses, apart from the nobles who had been disabled, the knight class, known as the foundation of feudalism, had been completely disabled at present. There are only more than 200 people left, which are basically useless. Therefore, these more than 100 wandering knights, well-trained reserve knights, are of a much higher quality than the knights in England at this time. Moreover, in a poor place like Scotland, there are not even many firearms, so this kind of knight has a lot of uses. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelists. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 311: The Scottish Riot. As mentioned above, Scotland is short of iron ore and rich in copper ore, but they lack the necessary smelting technology, not to mention firearms. Even England didn't have many of them. I'm afraid that what Duke Edward captured a while ago was all their inventory. Therefore, in the face of heavy cavalry like knights, against the Scots, the effect is actually quite obvious. You let them form a battalion alone, gather together, don't disperse. Thinking about it, the heavy cavalry is still powerful when they gather together, otherwise they are not as good as infantry if they are scattered. I'm afraid it's a bit difficult. Carilli said softly, touching his beard. I know that they belong to different mercenary groups, but if not, how can I let them be in the palm of my hand? Of course, Edward knew that these wandering knights were the central figures of various mercenary armies, and it was not easy for them to give up their rights. However, this is another thing that has to be done. It was easy to control these wandering knights by gathering them together, so that the group of 5,000 mercenaries dispersed into a group and no longer threatened him. After all, 5,000 troops are near London, which is a huge threat. Tell them, if you still want to have a chance to get the fiefdom, do as I say, or let them go back to Germany. Thinking of such a potential threat, Edward's voice became more serious, and he ordered, "Yes, Your Majesty, I will complete your instructions." Glancing at the king's stern eyes, Sir Carlyle lowered his head and agreed. "Okay, then, tell me, how did this triangular-shaped camp form?" As he spoke, Edward continued to lie on the girl's plump lap, asking lazily. The triangular shape is mainly due to the three large mercenary groups. The total number of the three has reached more than 3,000 people. The other scattered mercenary groups follow them separately, so the camp becomes a triangle. Then, it is even more necessary to carry out the proposal I just made, otherwise, it is very easy to cause military chaos. London is not far from here. Regarding this, Edward became more earnest. Soon, the carriage stopped in front of the mercenary camp. Edward did not enter the mercenary camp, but walked around the camp under the protection of the guards. I saw these mercenaries sitting scattered around a fire frame. A clay pot or iron pot was hung on the fire frame. Several people sat around and gathered together to keep warm by the temperature of the flames. Some of them had some hot water, or some animal bones and meat in this cold season of early spring. They are dressed in ragged clothes, and perhaps the most valuable thing is the long sword in their hands. Seeing this, Edward finally understood that being a mercenary in ancient times was a poor group of people, either poor or dying in a foreign country. This was their final outcome. Seeing the miserable appearance of this group of people, Edward felt a little pity, shook his head, and said to Lucy beside him, "You will send some bread and pork over later, and some sackcloth. They are here to fight. I don't want to lose precious troops at this time." After a few glances, Edward lost interest and had nothing to look at. Lucy glanced at the garbage mercenary over there, then at the king, and gave a slight grace. At this time, in the town of Danfries, Baron Danfries on this side was riding a horse, standing in front of his castle, looking at the densely packed soldiers in front of him. Baron Danfries couldn't help laughing behind him, followed by 23 knights and 2 knights, all wearing armor, the cold wind blowing the brightly colored banner behind him, looking extremely majestic, and in front of him, densely packed soldiers stood upright one by one, some with sharpened spears, some with dung forks. And their weapons were all kinds of strange. Although it looked a bit decadent, the 2,000-man army still gave him unlimited confidence. Lord Baron, with so many troops, how can those soft priests be our opponents? Behind him, a majestic knight, almost as big as 2 Baron Danfries, looked at the countless soldiers in front of him, and said to Baron Danfries in a deep voice, "I think it won't take a day, maybe just a morning, and the church will be defeated and flee. This group of hypocrites will definitely flee." Baron Danfries smiled at the flattery his subordinates patted. Obviously, he accepted it all, perhaps thinking of the wealth he was about to acquire. The smile on Baron Danfries' face deepened a bit. "Everyone, let us carry faith in the Almighty Lord and convey the glory of the Lord. Let us go forward bravely. God is watching us." Baron Danfries turned his head back, his plump face suddenly flushed with blood, and then turned his head again, yelling at the soldiers in front of him. The hoarse roar of Baron Danfries shocked the knights behind him for a while, and then followed his roar and shouted together, "For the glory of the Lord, down with these hypocrites. God is watching us." The soldiers in the front row were infected by this atmosphere, and their faces immediately became bloodshot, shouting loudly, "For the glory of the Lord, strike down the hypocrites. God is watching us." The other soldiers also followed the atmosphere and shouted together. So, 2,000 people shouted together, looking very imposing. And Baron Danfries became more and more confident in his heart how important it is to be famous as a teacher. Even when dealing with the priests, this group of ignorant villagers still chose to believe in their Lord. The prestige of hundreds of years is not fake. This is for the glory of the Lord. This is a good excuse for many years. 2,000 people is the largest number of people recruited within his rule, and he must win with one blow at this time. In front of the Danfries Cathedral, people gathered one after another, but Russell rushed over at this time, and stood in front of the church with Bishop Hobbs of Danfries, watching the chaotic scene ahead. It is said that they are soldiers, but in fact, most of them are some strong servants of squires and guards in the church, as well as some peasants who came here voluntarily, forced. All of a sudden, the priests following Bishop Hobbs became dazed one by one, giving up hope for this victory. Regarding this, Bishop Hobbs, who seemed to be calm, was actually very upset, but he didn't show it on his face. His palms were already covered with fine cold sweat. Chapter 312 The Scottish Riot. "Mr. Russell, I hope this is true. We can really win." Bishop Hobbs squinted his eyes and wiped the cold sweat from his hands on his sleeves, but with a confident smile on his face, he slightly opened his lips and said in a voice that could only be heard by 2 people although talking to Russell from a distance. Bishop Hobbs seemed fearless, with a confident smile on his face. Seeing this, the tense hearts of the priests next to them eased a little, and they were not afraid of the backbone, which gave them a lot of courage. "My lord priest, don't worry. To deal with those nobles, these farmers and soldiers are not the main force in the first place. They are just cheese to trap birds. The people who really deal with those nobles, I have already let them lie in ambush in the woods around the church. Only those stupid nobles can chase after them, and we can let them realize what a fat sheep waiting to be slaughtered." Russell fiddled with his long red hair casually, and said softly with a smile on the corner of his mouth from the side of Bishop Hobbs. Russell looked particularly sinister and cunning at this time, as well as that terrible smile. "Today is the end of the road to success for those nobles. I will definitely teach you a lesson for these traitors." Russell looked at the bustling peasants and soldiers in front of him, and a cold light flashed in the corner of his eyes. In his opinion, it was the compromise of the nobles that allowed the English to act willfully in Scotland, so when he thought that these arrogant nobles were going to be crushed by him, Russell felt a burst of joy in his heart. Glancing at Russell, Hobbs was also very helpless at this moment. In the current desperate situation, he had no choice but to trust this guy who was recommended by other bishops. If it is money and food, the Danfries church still has a lot of stocks, but the soldiers are something that the church cannot realize in a short time. So in the face of this passive situation, Hobbs can only believe that a man praised by other bishops. "My lord priest, I think that in a few days, Scotland will become a land bestowed by the Lord. I hope you will take good care of it by then." Of course Hobbs knew what Russell meant, but in the current extremely dangerous situation, is it really appropriate to talk about the future? At this moment, Hobbs wanted to beat up this arrogant guy to relieve his tension. "Mr. Russell, let's talk about the future later. I'm not in the mood now." Hobbs glanced sideways at Russell, twitched his eyebrows, and said in a cold voice immediately. He stopped paying attention to Russell, and looked closely into the distance, as if searching for the traces of Baron Danfrey's army. Seeing this, Russell naturally knew that the priest was in a bad mood, so he touched his nose with an embarrassed expression. Seeing this scene, the few priests behind him naturally would not interrupt without knowing the meaning, and the high platform became much quieter for a while. After a short silence, a sound of horseshoes startled everyone. His Excellency the Bishop, with a long ending sound. A rather burly knight was covered in leather armor, but there was no armor on his face. It could be seen that his face was very rough. I saw him coming on a horse, carrying a trail of dust, and came to Hobbs with a thud, thud, thud. With a beautiful turning action, he got off the horse quickly. I admired it in my heart, Your Excellency. According to the investigation of the cavalry, Baron Danfrey's team is only 5 miles away from us. The Scottish one can't be found. Only the English version can be used. We should prepare. The strong knight breathed a little hurriedly, staring at Bishop Hobbs with wide eyes, and then looked at the stranger next to him who was trusted by His Excellency, with some vigilance in his eyes. Knight Villiers, please get ready to defend the glory of our Lord. It's up to you now. Bishop Hobbs looked at the sturdy knight in front of him, bent slightly, and said very politely, this is what I should do. For the glory of the Lord, I will cry my blood. At this moment, Villiers' face was full of divine radiance, and a sense of glorious mission radiated from him, which made people admirable in this regard. Bishop Hobbs still believed it. The distance between Villiers and Danfrey's cathedral was more than 100 miles, but when he heard that the church was in danger, he took dozens of peasants and soldiers and hurried away. Came over without any hesitation. More importantly, Bishop Hobbs knew that this knight was his predecessor's godson, and he had the deepest affection for Danfrey's cathedral, and he would bring his family to pray every year. Therefore, for his trust, Hobbs is far deeper than Russell. For the glory of the Lord, Hobbs, Russell, and several priests behind them crossed their chests with both hands, muttering in unison. A minute later, Villiers saluted Hobbs as a knight. Under the service of his attendants, he put on a heavy armor and was helped onto the horse. Looking at the thousands of people, he shouted loudly, "Turn back!" The entire team of thousands of people then slowly began to turn around, and it took about 10 minutes for the front row to become the back row. At this time, Baron Danfrey, leading the large team, slowly approached this team, and the speed also slowed down. "Stop!" Baron Danfrey roared, and the entire team stopped following the orderer's message because he saw a burly knight standing at the front of the team, looking extremely burly. After the team stopped, the knight manipulated the horse, walked forward slowly, approached Baron Danfrey, and said loudly, "Your Excellency Baron Danfrey, please forgive my rudeness. I am extremely ashamed of your defiance of my lord. Next, I will use the army to let you know the consequences of insulting my lord," Villiers said to Baron Danfrey without haste. His tone was neither humble nor uttered, and it even contained a hint of a lesson. "Mr. Knight, I have always respected and worshipped my lord very much. An insult is purely a slander. Today, I am dealing with these false priests. Since Mr. Knight still wants to join in, please follow up. Get ready for the ransom." HMPH, without speculation, the Baron certainly knew the Knight Villiers, who often came here, and even maintained a friendly relationship, but in front of interests, everything was vain. So, in the end, Baron Danfrey snorted coldly and said something pretentious. Knight Villiers also sneered, turned his head and left. After returning, Villiers led the army and took the lead in attacking. Looking at the old, young, sick, and disabled church troops, Baron Danfrey burst out laughing. "Let's go, teach those hypocrites a lesson," Baron Danfrey roared, and the whole army sped up immediately, and the ground began to shake. Faced with such a scene, Knight Villiers was not stage frightened, and his face was full of determination. Thousands of infantrymen in front held their spears and roared loudly to embolden themselves. They marched forward with a large army, and when they saw that the opponent was weaker than themselves, their faces instantly had a trace of gratitude. The chances of survival are much higher faced with such a spectacular scene. Most of the peasants and soldiers on the church side became timid, their thighs trembling unceasingly. Seeing such a scene, Knight Villiers frowned but relaxed immediately. Sure enough, in the face of such a large army, the church army, who had been rushing away, scattered and fled in a hurry after being hit by a wave. Knight Villiers couldn't care less, and ran even faster with a few attendants in the rear. After seeing this scene, Baron Danfrey couldn't help but get excited. When this kind of victory is within grasp, the battle exploits are basically given away. How could the knights hold back? They clamped their legs and quickly chased after them. Ahead is not war, but a lot of gold coins. Chapter 313 Scottish Riot. In the rear, Hobbs' face trembled uncontrollably as he watched his side collapse at the touch of a finger, and his eyes widened. Even though he had expected it in his heart, he was still shocked suddenly, and his whole body seemed to be drenched in cold water. And shivering, and the red-haired Russell twitched a few times at the corner of his mouth. Even though he had expected these people to be rubbish, he didn't expect that they could be so rubbish. He had to re-evaluate the strength of Baron Danfries. If Hobbs and Russell looked calm on the surface, then the senior priests in the church behind them were twitching from the corners of their eyes, their legs were trembling, and their eyes were closed, as if appearing in front of them. What is in front of me is an illusion. His hands kept drawing the cross on his chest, his face turned pale, and his mouth kept whispering. If you listen carefully, you can hear the word God at this time. The figure of Knight Villiers slowly ran from a distance, slowly expanding from a black spot beside him. 2 young attendants followed on horseback. It was obvious that they were running very hard. Mr. Knight, rest for a while, thank you for your hard work. Seeing the Knight Villiers approaching, Hobbs looked into his eyes calmly, and said to him softly, without any trace of blame. This made several priests who were about to utter nonsense shut their mouths one after another, and looked at Knight Villiers reluctantly, and then looked at Hobbs with some curiosity and suspicion on the side. Russell glanced at Knight Villiers' clean armor, then at the 2 robust attendants beside him, and asked softly, "Mr. Knight, what is the specific situation like? How did the army collapse so quickly?" For a moment, Hobbs had a flash of appreciation in his eyes, which is exactly what he wanted to ask. It was a bit embarrassing for him to ask, and it would be more appropriate for an outsider like Russell to ask. Anyway, he left soon. Then, Knight Villiers felt a pair of fiery eyes scanning his body, and he could only show anger and a hint of embarrassment on his face. After the conversation with Baron Danfries, the 2 armies began to confront each other directly. Our side defended and they attacked. Unexpectedly, more than 1,000 spearmen directly pressed over from the opposite side. Those cowards were so frightened that their legs limped before they met. Broke up and fled. I can only escape back in shame. Alice, Villiers lowered his head slightly, not regaining his original high-spirited aura, and explained to everyone, it seems that the strength of Baron Danfries is still above our estimate, and it seems that these nobles are still hiding their strength. Hearing the explanation of Knight Villiers, Russell looked at the deserters following him, Dusty, and the approaching Baron Danfries' army. Now he can already see the family of Danfries. The flag was up, and a sneer formed on the corner of his mouth. It seems that we should prepare in advance this time, otherwise the consequences will be unpredictable. Hearing this, Bishop Hobbs raised his head, looked ahead, and nodded in agreement. My lord priest, do you think we are still prepared? At this time, a senior priest behind him took a step closer and interjected, his face full of surprise and disbelief. Of course, my lord is watching us, so how can he let his loyal servants be hurt? Bishop Hobbs prayed devoutly and said to several other priests on the other side. Knight Villiers also had a pious expression on his face. Obviously, he already knew about this matter, so he left the army without hesitation and fled back. At this time, the resentment of the priests behind him towards Knight Villiers disappeared a lot. After Bishop Hobbs prayed, his face suddenly brightened, and he pointed forward and said, "Look, this road is the main road leading to the church. If Baron Danfries wants to defeat us in one fell swoop, this is his best choice." The senior priests behind Bishop Hobbs looked over with his fingers. The main road appeared in their sight, and then looked at the other trails, and nodded involuntarily. On both sides of this road, there are lush foliage, but it is a good hiding place. The smile on Bishop Hobbs' face became more obvious, full of confidence. The pride of Baron Danfries at this time is the last joy before failure. In the next moment, when coming from Baron Danfries, the first thing you pass is a wheat field, and then there is a 10-foot wide dirt land with slightly green grass. On both sides of the mud are dense forests, towering trees as thick as several people. Unconsciously raised his neck, sight, and under the big trees on both sides, there are already nearly 3,000 troops recruited by the church, and they have been waiting for a long time. These troops are different from ordinary peasants and soldiers. Most of them are Scottish veterans who used to be mercenaries, and their combat effectiveness is much higher than that of the Baron's army. Bishop Hobbs, who learned of this, was naturally full of confidence going back to the other side. The knights under Baron Danfries were like a pack of wolves, wantonly playing with and killing the fleeing peasants and soldiers. Blood and stumps spread across the entire road at will. After following the troops comfortably, Baron Danfries was in a very comfortable mood at this time, thinking of the thousands of acres of excellent land in the church, and the countless gold coins and jewels in the cellar. His Excellency the Baron felt that what he was riding was not a horse, but a cloud in the sky. and his whole body became limp. Then, gradually, the horse on his lap snorted suddenly, which startled the Baron. Huh? His Excellency the Baron looked at the dismounted black horse, and after realizing that it was the horse's snort, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Damn horse. I'm scared to death. Let you experience the feeling of being hungry tonight. After cursing, the Baron looked around. The tall and dark trees stood upright on both sides of the road, which even looked a little scary. Whatever you think about, I want to win, and the Danfries family also has a place in Scotland. Shaking his head to drive away the strange thoughts in his mind, His Excellency the Baron thought carefully and murmured optimistically. However, this fear naturally harassed his heart and made him tense up. Suddenly, he heard footsteps in his ears, and just when he thought he was hallucinating, groups of soldiers suddenly appeared in front of his eyes, massacring indiscriminately. The Baron took a closer look, and saw a steady stream of soldiers jumping out of the forest, holding sharp iron tools in their hands, slashing at his soldiers. Then, the genes passed down from the ancestors come into play. Your Excellency the Baron didn't care about anything. He clamped his legs, the horse jumped, and then returned the same way. Chapter 314 The Scottish Riot. Soon, the Baron's army, which had been busy chasing and killing them, was stunned by this sudden attack. Afterwards, the powerful combat power and assault smashed the Baron's army to pieces in the blink of an eye. The original pursuer became the hunted, and his identity changed rapidly, and our Lord Baron took his personal guards to protect him, and ran away quickly. Nothing happened at all, and he was extremely safe. The Lord Baron ran for a while, and felt the horse under his crotch was panting non-stop, so he stopped slowly, and relieved his tense nerves by the way. As soon as it stopped, the guards on the side offered water, making the Baron nod in satisfaction. He took a sip hard to relieve the burning pain in his throat, and then His Excellency the Baron looked around. Only a few hundred cavalry followed behind him, stopping to recover from fatigue, casting their eyes on him from time to time. Not far away, scattered infantry walked over with heavy steps, and gathered one after another, but all the weapons in their hands were discarded, making the whole person empty and easy to escape. Hey, today is really unlucky. Harbs actually has reinforcements. It's so good to keep it a secret. Seeing his miserable appearance, His Excellency the Baron suddenly felt a sense of desperation, and couldn't help sneering. Knight Bunower, how many knights have escaped? To cheer up, Your Excellency the Baron asked the knight beside him who had been protecting him, with a hint of expectation in his eyes. Hearing Lord Baron's question, Knight Bunower looked at each other with several dusty knights around him, and then said in embarrassment, Your Excellency the Baron, currently only I, Knight Lacus, and Knight Martinton are fleeing, and the whereabouts of the other knights are unknown. Really? It seems that I have completely failed this time. When His Excellency the Baron heard that there were only 3 knights, his heart tightened, and a trace of cold sweat began to appear on his forehead. In Scotland, the economy and productivity are still in the Middle Ages, and knights are still an important military force in the entire European continent, not to mention Scotland. For the nobles, knights are an important pillar of the military, and they are also important assistants they trust. If you lose your soldiers, you can continue to recruit, but if the knights are captured, it will cost a lot of money. More importantly, in the current state of hostility with Danfries Cathedral, without the help of most of the knights, how could he turn defeat into victory? It seems that I lost this time my money. The Baron's head ached when he thought that after losing, he would have to sign a series of unequal treaties and pay a large amount of gold coins. Let's go. Go back first. Don't wait any longer. Seeing that hundreds of people had gathered in a short period of time, His Excellency the Baron planned to go back to his castle. If you waited any longer, people from the church would probably chase after him. As soon as he finished speaking, the horse under the Baron started to gallop. The 3 knights were silent and followed silently. At this time, after more than 2 hours of fighting, the battle, or massacre, ended in a complete victory for the church. This is a perfect ending. Bishop Hobbs thought beautifully in his heart. After the massacre, the support troops participating in the assault mission rested on the church square, either sitting, lying, or squatting, looking extremely spectacular. What is even more eye-catching is that their bodies and the weapons in their hands are filled with bright blood, which looks so dazzling in the sun. After resting for a while, the leader of the assault team walked up to young Russell, bowed lightly, and greeted him respectfully. Mr. Russell, Lord Priest, we have successfully completed the support task. Deverman, who was in his 30s, was originally a mercenary, and he was also the commander of the regiment, so his combat literacy and experience were extremely rich. In order to hire him, Russell paid a lot of money, but at this time, his usual calm and steady face now showed a trace of complacency and relaxation. Obviously, This relaxed battle made him feel relaxed and comfortable. Mr. Deverman, you won the battle this time, and you want to be beautiful. You really deserve to be the famous Deverman the Slayer. Russell looked at the scarred man in front of him and couldn't help but praise. However, let me trouble you, that greedy baron has escaped, and we are going to capture him now. Russell finally added, yes, this blasphemer must be arrested in order to wash away the humiliation of our lord. Bishop Hobbs maintained a faint smile and added softly, follow your instructions, we will set off tomorrow. After thinking about it for a while, Doverman agreed. The battle just now did not consume much energy. After one night, the soldiers could continue to fight. Regarding Deverman's words, Russell and Hobbs agreed with each other and nodded. Judging from today's battle results, Baron Danfries can only hide in the castle and shiver, and he no longer has that arrogant attitude. The next day, the rested support troops rushed to the castle slowly, and everyone along the way was full of confidence in this battle. However, when he arrived at the Baron's castle, he suddenly found that there were already majestic soldiers standing on the castle, looking heavily guarded. Seeing this, Deverman tried to attack the city, and found that these guards were definitely not fakes, and the defense was very strong, so he retreated very wisely. And it was pointless to persist. On the second day after he went back, Baron Danfries came again with his army. This time he learned his lesson. The team thickened and slowed down when passing through the forest, and when they arrived at the cathedral, Deverman's 3,000 troops were waiting for them, and Baron Danfries is not bad here. Although the combat power cannot keep up, the number of people has reached 4,000, and the outcome may not be known. Attack. At this time, it was not Baron Danfries who commanded the army, but a man with a mustache, exuding an air of arrogance. Faced with such an open attack, Deverman could only choose to attack at the same time and fight head-on. And this is, under a hillside a few miles away, a large army is stopping to repair, and the Tudor royal family flag is fluttering in the wind. Guy, when do you say they'll end? I'm guessing 3 hours, I bet £1. What about you? The young king held the binoculars, looked at the dark figure in front of him, and boldly bet with a blood-blade leader. Guy Ham, your majesty, I have no money. Guy Ham was silent for a moment, then said in a deep voice. Chapter 315 The Scottish Riot. Edward looked at the big man who led the spy department speechlessly, and was also drunk with his stinginess. Then, let's just wait. Let's watch this good show. When they are about to finish playing, Edward turned his head, ignored the boring Guy Ham, and walked into his carriage boldly, lying on the comfortable Persian blanket. His nerves relaxed a lot. 10 days ago, 5,000 mercenaries, 2,000 noble private soldiers, and 3,000 guards came with the king. Since Dumfries Scavery County is adjacent to England, Edward has been staying in York City to wait and see what happens. Originally, Edward planned to wait for the Scottish riots before mobilizing the army. However, this good show was gone, which could not satisfy the curiosity in his heart. To be honest, including the decades in his previous life and this life, he hasn't really seen a war in the 16th century. The last time he came to Scotland, he just came to Edinburgh with a smooth journey, enjoying the fruits of victory directly. He couldn't feel the smoke of war at all. Up this time is a good opportunity, from a few miles away, to watch this 16th century battle, and then go back and wait for the opportunity. Originally watching this ancient battle scene, Edward was actually a little bit excited, but after watching it for more than 10 minutes, the troops were hacking at each other, and there was no battle at all. Thousands of people hacked at each other. It seemed like a big scene, but it was just like that. After a while, Edward got bored. If it wasn't for knowing the result, he would have gone back a long time ago. Thinking of today's futile escape, Edward slowly fell asleep. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. In a daze, a call came from Edward's ear. Rubbing his sleepy eyes, Edward gave a soft acknowledgement, straightened his clothes and hair, got up and got out of the car. Your Majesty, this battle is over. With a smile on his face, Guy said in a deep voice. Guy has always been worried about His Majesty the King leaving the large army privately to watch the battle secretly. This is in Scotland and it is extremely dangerous. Simply, this battle is over. It's time to go back. Looking at the joyous Guy, Edward also had helplessness on his face, so he could only ask, which side won? It's the church side, but their losses are quite heavy, and Baron Danfries also ran away. Saying that, Guy also looked emotional for the nobles. He was born with a good impression, and of course he supported the nobles in his heart. Hearing this, Edward curled his lips and sneered softly. This is what I want. Whether it's the nobles winning or the church winning, it's all what I want. The more chaos the better. Let's go. It's time for us to go back. Let them Scots play. Slowly, Edward glanced at the gradually calming battlefield in the distance, boarded the carriage, uttered a word, and entered the carriage directly. Guy shook his head, led the whole team, jumped on the horse, then approached the carriage, and started walking towards England. Hundreds of people came and went quietly without leaving a trace. At this time, in Dumfries Cathedral, under the portrait of the benevolent Virgin Mary and Child playing, Russell's face was ashen, and he was in a bad mood, and Bishop Hobbs had a smile on his face, and he was in a very good mood. "Russell, today is such a good day," Hobbs said to Russell excitedly. "This victory is really hard to come by. But, next, I'm afraid it will be hard to say." There was a cold light in Russell's eyes, but blood was dripping from his heart. "These are all hired by him, and they are also one of his important trump cards. Isn't it heartbreaking to lose them so soon?" There were 3,000 people, nearly 2,000 were killed and injured, and the remaining 1,000 people were also slightly injured, and lost the belief in fighting again, and were also abolished. "What did you say?" "This matter is not over yet." Hobbs listened, and asked in surprise, with a terrified expression. "Yes, the 4,000 people supporting Baron Dumfries this time, almost all of them were armed, and there were even hundreds of cavalry. This is not the support that ordinary low-level nobles can obtain, so, this time, only the group of people in Edinburgh are left." Russell looked at the front seriously, but kept talking, as if it was a normal thing. "Are you talking about the 4 major families?" It was said that Hobbs's face was covered with fine cold sweat, and the news frightened him. "In Scotland, not even the royal family can compete with the 4 major families, and even the Archbishop of the Scottish diocese is held by David Beaton, one of the 4 major families. It is conceivable how powerful they are. More than that." Russell looked at Bishop Hobbs' panic, and continued, "There are other nobles, they have joined forces and are preparing to take us down in one fell swoop. We are in real danger," Russell said in an unprecedented serious tone, and his whole body tensed up. "If you say you're not worried or afraid, that's a lie." He was originally a businessman at best. Although his wealth and reputation in Scotland were still very high, compared with the 4 big families, that was nothing. It was the first time he faced the 4 major families like this, and he was more afraid than happy. Bishop Hobbs turned pale with fright, and his legs trembled. Sure enough, 3 days later, in Edinburgh, the 4 major families headed by the ruling Earl of Allen made a formal speech in the Parliament, denouncing the rebellion of the Dumfries Cathedral, and they also denounced the bad behavior of some local churches against the King's order. As soon as this remark was made, it directly brought an end to Scotland's original cannibalization policy of boiled frogs in warm water. What came from it was the direct and strong push strategy of the nobles. Perhaps, the devoured fruit has whetted the appetites of the nobles, and the hungry wolf that tasted the blood has already opened its bloody mouth and started to eat desperately. And the church side is not easy to mess with. Although the scolding order sent by Rome was sent to London by the nobles, the churches in other places are finally choosing to unite. The church took advantage of the money and recruited a lot of soldiers. Soon, their army swelled up like a balloon, leaping to the level of 10,000 people at an astonishing speed, and it was still growing, and the nobles were not to be outdone. They prepared vigorously, and the number of people rushed to catch up. Finally, after nearly 10 days, the nobles and the church each supported more than 20,000 soldiers, and a drama no less than the War of the Roses began. Chapter 316 War? Peace? These more than 40,000 people launched a large-scale blood battle on the vast plateau. The blood spread on the plateau, nourishing the green grass and wildflowers, and made outstanding contributions to this year's agriculture and animal husbandry. What is the concept of 40,000 people? According to Britain's own statistics, by 1601, the combined total of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales was only 1.9 million, excluding the 630,000 in Wales and the 300,000 in Northern Ireland. That is to say, the whole of Scotland is only 1 million, and if we make more statistics, excluding the old, weak, sick, disabled, women, and the population killed by Duke Edward a while ago, the current young labor force is at most 100,000. This civil war is equivalent to half of Scotland's prime of life fighting, and compared to Scotland, the scale is huge. When James IV invaded England, only 20,000 troops were mobilized. Therefore, this thrilling civil war is more intense than the invasion war between England and Scotland. There is nothing that can stop them, even if they belong to the same ethnic group. The fighting will be fiercer. The battle of 40,000 people is quite large in scale. With a sea of people, however, the time ended quickly, and in less than 7 days, the two fought each other and lost both sides. The church relied on wealth, and employed some mercenaries who had often wandered around the continent of Europe. The officer class was quite powerful, and with sharp weapons and armor, it was comparable to the nobles on the noble side, relying on the vassals inherited from generation to generation. and the private soldiers who have served their families for generations. The elite soldiers occupy a small part, and they still have an advantage overall. Therefore, the church with a lot of money and time, in the long run, will rely on money to slowly drag these poor nobles to death. This is not alarmist talk. After the ransom plundered by Edward some time ago, coupled with the already sluggish economy, the Scottish nobles bit the church like a wolf and a tiger. Therefore, even though the two sides suffered more than 5,000 casualties each after this battle, they still did not choose to give up for the sake of their own interests at this time. The news that the King of England's army had arrived in Scotland made them feel at ease at this time. They only had one sentence in their hearts: the wolf is coming, and it's still a hungry wolf. A hungry wolf with a big mouth. They understand that this hungry wolf will not go back without biting off a piece of meat. The two sides stopped the war with self-knowledge, and became alert to each other in a tacit understanding, and the war temporarily stopped at this time. Our king happened to be only 2 days away from them. About 100 miles, my lords, the English are coming, and a hungry wolf is coming. This time, we are not just cutting our flesh and bleeding. In my opinion, he wants to swallow us in one gulp, leaving no room for us, sitting on everyone. Russell squinted his eyes slightly, looked around with deep eyes, frowned, with a worried look on his face. Then he patted the desk and said in a heavy voice, since he led the army to defeat Baron Danfries last time, and he helped churches escape property in various places, Russell's prestige has increased linearly in terms of commanding operations. He is the most important speaker, and bishops from all over the world have also acquiesced. That's why he sat on the throne as a businessman, feeling emotional with other bishops. Your Excellency Russell, under such circumstances, why don't we compromise with the nobles? Bishop Hobbs saw that this was another battle between the two countries. His eyelids twitched, and he said softly with some hesitation, my Bishop Hobbs, your church is safe and sound, while we have been looted. Will you make up for the damage? Negotiating a peace is absolutely impossible. On the other side, a bishop with a sharp chin, wearing a white cassock, tremblingly stretched out his thin left hand in the wide sleeve, firmly denied it. After finishing speaking, he looked at Bishop Hobbs with sharp eyes, and the aggrieved eyes made Bishop Hobbs afraid to look at each other. But then he remembered his mission again, opened his eyes wide, and stared at each other, refusing to give in to each other. As soon as the two spoke, the bishops in the tent immediately divided into two factions. The peace faction and the war faction blamed each other. All of a sudden, the entire discussion tent was noisy, shaking Russell's eardrums. Okay, adults, be quiet. At this time, quiet discussion is the only prerequisite for our solution. Russell scratched his long red hair and said loudly. This sentence really made them quiet. In my opinion, it is indeed too easy to stop the war with the nobles like this. Russell glanced at Bishop Hobbs and explained softly. Immediately, he turned his head to look at the other party, and said softly, if you simply refuse to make peace with the nobles, then England will directly annex us, and Scotland will be in danger. Russell fought like a peacemaker, trying to achieve his goal. We can let the nobles return some of the embezzled church property, and then unite with each other to drive out the English. Seeing that the faces of the two parties were still cold and dismissive, Russell came up with an idea again. Alternatively, we can unite temporarily, and after driving the English away, we can continue the suspended war with a group of nobles. Is that okay? Seeing the agitation of the two parties, Russell finally let go of his heart, finally reached a consensus. Just continue to talk on the line. At this time, the nobles also began to discuss negotiating peace and war. These two words are heard endlessly, directly sweeping away the cold air of the entire tent in early spring. At this time, the leader of the noble army was the young Earl of Argyll, Archibald Campbell, who was in his 20s and commanded the noble army. The original Scottish regent, the Earl of Allen, was old and overwhelmed. This time, it was the young Earl of Allen who fought against the churches for the dissatisfaction of the nobles. That doesn't exist. You are one of the 4 major families, and other nobles have to obey because of their noble background. Your Excellency, what is the King of England doing in Scotland this time? Does he have any intentions? On the side, a nobleman in his 40s or 50s bowed his body and asked softly to the young Earl who was sitting upright. What can there be? He doesn't want to swallow our Scotland whole. He is already dissatisfied with the common king and wants to rule Scotland substantially. The younger Earl Lennox moved his lips lightly and said angrily. Chapter 317 Joint Operations. After hearing Earl Lennox's words, the nobles nodded their heads in agreement from the bottom of their hearts. The monarch of England's ambition for Scotland is simply the sun in the sky, shining brightly, and has never concealed it. For this reason, The Scots allied with the French in order to resist the ambitions of the English. However, it still cannot stop England's ambitions. In the past few years, Scotland finally honored Edward VI and Queen Mary as co-monarchs in name, and Scotland and England became the United Kingdom. But all of this still did not satisfy Edward. After all, he is only a monarch in name, and Scotland's executive power, judicial power, military power, and half of the legislative power are not in his hands. Every year, he can only enjoy some tax revenue, which is tens of thousands of pounds at most, as a poor Scot, so being a king is meaningless. Therefore, leading an army of 10,000 this time, he is preparing to take Scotland into his arms once and for all. Then we can only unite with the church, otherwise it will be difficult to resist the English. Earl Alan, who was sitting on the main seat, frowned slightly when he heard the words, and said no, absolutely not. David Beaton, who had been a silent listener, that is, His Excellency David Beaton, Archbishop of the Diocese of Scotland, was excited like a fox whose tail had been stepped on when he heard that peace was to be negotiated. Shouted, the group of hypocrites must never be forgiven. Even if Scotland is annexed by the English, it is impossible to negotiate peace with a group of hypocrites. As a staunch Protestant among the nobles, David Beaton would never give up this good opportunity to suppress Catholics, even at the expense of Scotland's interests. There is a reason for this. Apart from his dissatisfaction with the Church of Rome and the devouring interests of the Church of Scotland, what dissatisfies David Beaton the most is that he has not been able to marry a wife and has no heirs. Of course, it doesn't mean that he has no children. He already has several illegitimate daughters and illegitimate children, but the legitimate descendants born without a wife are not considered to have heirs. Finally, the eldest brother died, and he became the patriarch, but he has no heirs. In this way, the earl's title will be passed on to the collateral, which is unacceptable. Therefore, sweeping away Catholicism and accepting Protestantism is the most important thing for David Beaton. Yes, absolutely not. I agree with Archbishop Beaton's proposal. Earl Lennox on the side also echoed loudly, very resolutely. Then, most of the nobles also objected in unison, expressing their opposition to such a proposal. Earl Argyll looked at it strangely when he heard the words. And then he realized it in his heart. After the peace talks, we can't continue to embezzle the church property. How can we stop if we haven't made up the shortfall? Thinking about it this way, Earl Argyll immediately abandoned the idea of peace talks, and his shortfall has not yet been fully made up at this time. A guard came in, knelt down on one knee, and said loudly, "My lord, the English have sent envoys to ask for an audience." At this time, the arguing voices stopped immediately, and they all looked outside the door. "Let him in. Listen to what the young His Majesty wants to say." Earl Argyll glanced at Bishop Beaton and Earl Lennox, and after receiving approval, he ordered, "Let him in." After a while, a well-dressed middle-aged man walked in. "Good day, my lords, your excellency. I don't know what orders His Majesty the King has." Earl Argyll stood up, bowed slightly to him, and returned the gift in a very aristocratic style. "My lords, His Majesty the King is 100 miles away at this time. He entrusted me with a message to you all." The messenger looked around, glanced at the densely packed nobles in the tent, and said with a smile, "Oh, it's my honor to wait. Please sit down and talk." Earl Argyll welcomed him in quickly, and said kindly. The envoy also smiled when he heard the words, sat down obediently, and then continued, "Everyone, His Majesty the King let me here to tell everyone that it's time to choose again." After the messenger's words fell, the entire tent was suddenly quiet. Only the sound of the wind blowing could be heard. Another choice. The nobles still remember that the last choice was Edinburgh. At that time, for their own lives and property, the nobles collectively sold the Stuart royal family, and even established it in the form of legislation. And this time, another choice came, whether to unite with the church or unite with a monarch in name. This is the question. But is this really the problem? Nobles say it's easy in this way. In front of the envoy, the nobles discussed each other sentence by sentence. After half an hour, the nobles finally made a choice. "Your Excellency the Messenger, we are willing to follow His Majesty's suggestion and work together to destroy those hypocrites." Earl Argyll stood up and said with a smile on behalf of the nobles, "Very well, Your Excellency the Earl, and all your lords, this is the wisest choice." The messenger smiled heartily and shook hands with him. The two did not discuss the specific conditions. They knew that this would need to be discussed slowly after His Majesty the King met with them. As for why Edward would choose to unite the nobles to deal with the church forces, this is almost obvious. First of all, he only has 10,000 troops. If he wants to annihilate the nobles and the church in one fell swoop, it is wishful thinking and impossible. In addition, if you dry up the parliament, you will get more benefits, which is much better than drying up the current shriveled nobles. Therefore, Edward chose to unite with the nobles immediately, and the nobles chose to agree without hesitation. This is a smart choice. 2 days later, more than 10,000 troops of the nobles and Edward's 10,000 troops began to join forces. The Marquess of Wellington, who was stationed in Edinburgh, also led 2,000 soldiers to join the peace. Viscount Eo and Viscount Smith each led hundreds of private troops to join forces. All of a sudden, Edward was no different from the army of the Scottish nobles. Moreover, most of Edward's army as mercenaries and guards. It can be said that it can basically completely crush the noble army as an aristocrat, especially a king, and to a certain extent, it is a kind of civil war, so it is natural to need a high-sounding reason to fight. After Our Majesty the King united with the nobles, he immediately raised the banner of exterminating the hypocrites and traitors, and led the united army towards the church army. Hearing that the English and Scottish nobles had united, the bishops of the church turned on the mode of scolding mothers one after another, and all kinds of curses were endless. However, nature cannot prevent the decisive battle from coming. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 318, The Curtain Ends. On this day, the wind was sunny and everything was revived. The birds flapped their wings in terror, chirped, and flew around, with sharp beaks, as if they couldn't stop talking. For this decisive battle, the location was chosen on a flat ground near the church army, which was large enough to accommodate the battle of tens of thousands of troops. Originally, Edward took the stance of taking the lead, and the army hurried to the vicinity of the church army barracks, half surrounded it, in an attempt to coerce them to surrender. Naturally, the church army would not give in. After a few days of confrontation, the two armies agreed on a place to start a decisive battle. To be honest, Edward was originally planning to launch a surprise attack, or a strong attack. An above-board decisive battle is completely inconsistent with the status of a traverser, and it also contradicts his thinking of winning victory by any means. However, the old-fashioned Scottish nobles still demanded the implementation of ancient traditions, and expressed incomprehension of his proposal, and even said that it would be disgraceful to violate the noble traditions directly, and only a villain would do such a despicable act. Seeing this, Edward was so angry that his forehead hurt, and he had the urge to throw the table. At that time, this group of old-fashioned aristocrats accounted for half of the troops, and Edward reluctantly chose to submit, and the church army who had been defending seemed to be a little unwilling, and directly launched a battle. Of course, only Edward knew that this was because there was not much food on the church army, and he had cut off the logistics supply, so he could only choose to fight with tears in his eyes. So, today, Edward set up a large army to compete with the church army. There are more than 30,000 people on Edward's side, and more than 10,000 people on the church side, almost double the gap on the side of the coalition army. The soldiers strode forward with their heads held high. The strong wind was blowing the banners of the royal family and other nobles. Lost voice before the battle, there was no dialogue with each other, and Edward didn't want to talk nonsense, so he pulled out the army and started directly on the side of the church. Russell is still in command at this time. His face was full of seriousness, without a trace of a smile, and he stared straight ahead, that is, the fluttering red and white rose flag. Let's attack. Closing his eyes, Russell said helplessly. The bitterness in the corner of his mouth couldn't be restrained no matter what. The sudden arrival of the King of England and the rapid rebellion of the nobles put him and the church in an extremely unfavorable situation. It can be said that there is little hope in this regard. Russell can only choose to put all his eggs in one basket. He has no choice, and the same is true for other bishops. They knew that His Majesty Edward, who believed in Protestantism, joined forces with those hungry wolf-like nobles, and there was absolutely no good ending waiting for them. This was also their helpless choice. On the side of the united army, the uniforms of England are red and white, and the uniforms of the nobles are blue and grey. The church army, on the other hand, was wearing black linen clothes with white crosses embroidered on them, which was very conspicuous at this time. The blue-grey troops of the nobles were the first to be dispatched, marching towards the church in a hurry, attacking with arrogance relying on the command power in their hands. The nobles could only obey Edward's orders and act as vanguards. Tens of thousands of pikemen attacked. But the church side did not take the initiative and defended on the spot. I saw a large number of strong soldiers suddenly appearing in the front row of the church, dragging a thick wooden shield about 7 feet long in their hands, and put it down on the spot, giving a great deterrent to the advancing soldiers on the noble side. I didn't expect the Scots to do this trick. And the Spaniard's method has been noticed. Looking at the rows of wooden shields, Edward shook his head, thinking inwardly. According to the Spanish phalanx model, large-scale shields are implemented in front, and spears are exposed in the gaps to prevent cavalry from charging. The horse will naturally turn to the sharp wooden sign formation in front, exposing the infantry behind. Afterwards, the archers, gunners, and musketeers in the back row attack all at once. This is the essence of the Spanish phalanx, which defeated the medieval armies. The Spanish phalanx without artillery and muskets is at most just more resistance, and it can't stop the general trend much. Besides, having more obstacles is not a bad thing for him. Let those nobles taste the pain. Sure enough, the spearmen approached step by step, but were stopped by shields that were as tall as a person, and the archers behind took advantage of the situation and released sharp arrows in an instant. The grey-blue army that couldn't advance or retreat was blocked there, being massacred by the church army. As a result, the nobles immediately dispatched cavalry. However, the number of cavalry is not enough, and it is still unable to break through the strictly guarded church army. Seeing that their army was dying, the nobles immediately panicked, and hurriedly begged to see the young king, asking him to send troops to attack. Edward dawdled for a while, and after he couldn't delay the time, he sent out a large army to attack. The church army, which had been pumping up all the time, was able to persist with the same size of the noble army, but with an army twice the size. This was not a straw, but a mountain, which directly crushed as a result. Noble 1, who had been beaten for a long time, cheered up and attacked wantonly. Cooperating with the English army, a gap suddenly appeared in the shield soldiers, and then a big defeat came. Victory. Victory? The war is still so simple. Edward was riding on a horse, facing the front, with a gratified smile on his face, and his voice went with the wind. More than 10,000 people were like fleeing lambs in a panic, being chased wantonly by a group of hungry wolves. In this era, don't expect the army to regroup and retreat slowly and orderly as long as it is washed away. An army with low quality is like quicksand, and it is easy to come and go in a hurry. It is impossible in reality to fight back and forth in a stalemate like in movies and TV. Therefore, after seeing the precarious scene ahead, Russell and the bishops hurriedly walked towards the camp under the escort of loyal and strong mercenaries around them. The united army brandished the long spears in their hands recklessly, striding forward, gaining military merits within reach. Watching the fan-shaped army drifting away, Edward raised his binoculars and watched the fleeing bishops in rich clothes approaching their own camp. He knew that next, those bishops would definitely surrender, and he just had to think about what treaty they would sign with Blood Earl Lennox, Marquess of Edinburgh. Let the soldiers come back. There is nothing to gain now. Edward put down the binoculars in his hand, and whispered to the two marquises beside him. Next, the most important thing is the group of nobles. The church has ended in Scotland. Chapter 319, Proposal to Surrender. Master Blanche, tell me, what should we do now? Different from the dimly lit main tent, the other tent in the barracks was brightly lit with twinkling lights. From the outside, there were vague figures, as if they were plotting something. The dark figure inside seemed to open its mouth, speaking something, but ordinary people can't get close. A dozen tall and burly soldiers opened their eyes and patrolled meticulously. It can be said that even Russell, the commander of the army, couldn't get close because they are knights belonging to the church. Their devout faith and daily exercise, brainwashing, make the loyalty of this group of church knights directly full, and the bishop of the church is the only one who commands them. Therefore, many of the bishops inside were sitting on their own, with relaxed expressions, talking freely, without worrying that anyone would hear them, or they didn't care. After all, the entire camp is filled with church soldiers, so no one dares to come here. After the defeat in the morning, there were more than 10,000 people when we went out, but only more than 2,000 people have returned. The rest were either captured or fled. We are already in trouble. A skinny bishop sat on a chair. His skinny body was completely different from the others. He kept sighing, looking worried, but his eyes turned to the white-bearded old man sitting quietly beside him. That's right, Master Blanche, we have failed today, and it is up to you to decide what to do next. Bishop Hobbs on the side couldn't bear the urgency in his heart, and said in a deep voice, Bishop Blanche used to be the bishop who went to Rome to meet the church. In the whole of Scotland, except for Archbishop David Beaton, he has the greatest prestige, but because of his old age, he has not been able to stand out, allowing Russell to toss, or in other words, he is optimistic about Russell's behavior and holds a default attitude. But today, after this big failure, everyone had to ask him to come out and call the shots. Ahem. Everyone, I didn't want to be famous. Blanche's hair is all white, her lips are a little chapped, and she looks old, but when she speaks, she is very imposing and confident. As he spoke, He narrowed his eyes and glanced around. These bishops were staring at him one by one, moving with his gaze. However, today has come to the moment of life and death of the church. As a servant of our Lord and a member of the church, I cannot sit idly by. Blanche stretched out his withered right hand, and said in a deep voice, with a bright light in his eyes, so, my decision is to surrender to the Englishman. What? My lord, think twice. The bishops on the side seemed to have seen a ghost. With astonished expressions, they couldn't help crying out as soon as Blanche finished speaking. Voices of persuasion and questioning immediately sounded in the entire tent. Blanche's skinny face immediately became serious, and even looked a little angry. Everyone, I didn't want to come out at first, and I was planning to retire at home, but you invited me here, and when I said it, you quickly questioned it. Then I will leave now, Blanche said angrily, leaned on the chair, and made a gesture to leave. My lord, this is all our fault. Please stop and have something to say. With a shy face, Hobbs supported Blanche's body, persuading him, and the other bishops also seemed to know their mistakes. And they repeatedly admitted their mistakes and apologized. At this moment, Blanche's complexion changed from cloudy to sunny, revealing a smile. He sat down slowly with the support of Hobbs, raised his head, and said earnestly, I know everyone's thoughts. Surrender is indeed unacceptable, but do we still have a choice? Blanche's rhetorical question made the tent suddenly quiet. The silence was frightening, and the cold was painful. If they were able to go back, everyone would have gone back a long time ago, but the appearance of this group of stragglers, after returning, they were just defeated one by the nobles. Why not stay? There must be a way out. Didn't someone come up with an idea? The silence of the crowd made Blanche's voice more powerful. The surrender I am talking about is not surrendering to the nobles, but surrendering to the English. Is there any difference between the English and the Scottish nobles? I would rather surrender to those nobles. At this time, one of the bishops held his face and said angrily, surrendering to those nobles, I'm afraid we will be swallowed to nothing. The integrity of the nobles is comparable to the devils in hell. Blanche sneered and said lightly, but the King of England is different. Although the Anglican sect is somewhat difficult to accept, it is better than the group of Martin Luther and Calvin. At least, we bishops, it still recognizes it. Compared with other Protestants, the Anglican sect still maintains the bishop system. It is not democratically elected, and many privileges are confiscated. This is unacceptable to these adults who have enjoyed rights for a long time. Moreover, I am sure that the King of England can promise us that we will not confiscate all the property of the church, but leave at least 1/10 of it to support the church. Blanche glanced around, and continued, if it's those nobles, I'm afraid we will be swallowed without even the skin. Surrender in the English, at least you can save some vitality. But, Mrs. Blanche, why did you surrender? Can't you negotiate a peace? At this time, everyone realized that Blanche had been talking about surrender, and his eyes were focused on his face. Surrender and peace negotiations are completely two choices. One is no autonomy, the other is limited autonomy. The difference is huge. Negotiation? Ladies and gentlemen, with our current strength, surrendering early is much more sincere than Yi, and even has an advantage over Yi. Besides, it's up to those nobles to agree to our surrender. After all, we've been captured, and everything is theirs. Blanche continued to talk, gradually dissipating the confidence in everyone's hearts. Seeing that the decadence on their faces was evident, Blanche's eyes inadvertently showed a hint of a smile. I finally finished it. It took a lot of saliva. He especially remembered that a month ago, a Scottish businessman came to ask for an interview, and he only revealed his true identity when he was getting agitated. His Majesty Edward of England respects him very much, especially his current position is seriously inconsistent with his identity. Therefore, the young king promised him through the mouth of the merchant that if he persuaded the Scottish priests to surrender to him, a Bishop of Edinburgh would be inevitable. You know, apart from the Archbishop, the Bishop of Edinburgh is the most powerful position in the Church of Scotland. Chapter 320 Untitled. For now, let's take Russell as our scapegoat. Blanche narrowed his eyes, with the cold light in his eyes, and said softly, England and that group of nobles have killed and injured so many people. There must be an explanation, and he has always been the commander of our army, so he should take this responsibility as a matter of course. Regarding these words, Blanche was speaking with awe-inspiring righteousness. If Hobbs and the others hadn't known the details, they would have believed his words. Old fox. The bishops, who were listening attentively, showed approval on their faces, and cursed silently in their hearts. They finally figured out why they couldn't invite the old fox before. It turned out that he had a good plan. I'd rather be a shrinking turtle who just hides behind, and let Russell, a businessman, be a scapegoat who can withstand most of the wind and rain. Therefore, The bishops began to mourn for Russell one by one, but the action did not delay. Together act immediately. I'm afraid he will run away. Hobbs got up straight away, glanced at the tent with piercing eyes, and said loudly afterwards. The bishops followed swiftly, without blushing or heartbeat, without any regard for Russell's feelings. The furious bishops walked out of the tent with quick steps afterwards. Hundreds of loyal guards automatically followed behind them, following them blankly. The clanging of the knives at their waists was especially loud in the silent camp at this time. Our Mr. Russell had already packed his bags and left the barracks on horseback with only 100 or so mercenaries left. The nighttime chill was uncomfortably cold, and even with several layers of clothing on, the humidity in the air was chilly to the hands and feet. Your Excellency, why did we leave overnight? The night is very cold. Half a body behind Russell, a big man with yellow hair, was panting and asking questions. His mouth was breathing hot air, and there was a little dew on his eyebrows. Obviously, the cold air at night made this big man a little unbearable. Ahem. Russell coughed, glanced at the big man behind him, and continued without changing his expression. Don't go? Are you waiting to be caught by those nobles? I don't want to die. Russell's voice was still trembling. Obviously, he was not feeling well either. Hearing the words, the big man behind him fell silent immediately, and it could be seen that his eyes were still full of doubts. Not only him, but also the rest of the mercenaries. Leaving the camp without knowing why, even if they gave money, it's still a bit too much for an employer, and Russell was naturally clear, and then explained in a low voice. The group of nobles gathered together as soon as they came back. I don't know what they were discussing. Don't have to guess. I know that in such a disparate environment, a peace negotiation is inevitable. He, and my nominal leader, is the best scapegoat. If I don't leave now, I think, by tomorrow, I will be decapitated. As the voice fell, Russell's tone became deeper and deeper. Obviously, from a leader of a large army to a scapegoat in the hands of nobles, Russell is also in a bad mood. Besides, I think your salaries are probably gone too. Those nobles and priests don't care about you. After Russell finished speaking, he continued to drive on the road. The mercenaries behind glanced at each other and continued to follow silently. At this time, Bishop Hobbs and his party had already arrived at the main tent. After seeing the guards and the pitch-black tent lying on the ground, they stared at each other with anger in their eyes. What a pity that a scapegoat is gone. The next day, under the leadership of Blanche, 28 bishops from all over the world, as well as the remaining 2,000 soldiers, surrendered to Edward. Edward kindly comforted Bishop Blanche, and was satisfied with the voluntary surrender of the bishops. And I promise that I will fulfill my promise, and I will never break my promise and get fat. The moment His Majesty the King walked out of the barracks, the nobles' side suddenly became lively. According to the original division, the aristocratic army and the English army were separated. In other words, the aristocrats did not believe in Edward's integrity. 3. And Edward doesn't really believe in the integrity of these nobles. After all, they are people who can sell even the king for money. After the Earl of Argyll and the others got the report, they watched helplessly as the young king rode a horse and led the team away from the camp, step by step towards the church camp. Seeing this, as the leader of the aristocratic coalition, Earl Lennox naturally sent people to follow. Every move of the English had a great influence on their nobles. The Earl of Argyll and others stayed in the tent restlessly, wondering what a cunning king was doing. Not long after, a soldier ran in quickly, panting. Obviously, he was in a hurry. My lord, my lords, the soldier bent over and said loudly. Speak. What did the young king do? The Earl of Argyll approached the soldier and asked eagerly. Approaching the big man in front of his eyes made the soldier flustered, and he was silent for a while before continuing. The King of England left the promise with the army, and went to the church barracks opposite. I saw those bishops leaving the camp one after another, leading the army, bowing to the king, and the king personally received them. As soon as the soldier finished speaking, the face of the noble beside him was filled with surprise. The same is true for the Earl of Argyll, who is the leader. This news is too important. You go down first, the Earl ordered casually, and then sat down slowly. What is the brain of this young king? In a few days, we will wipe out this group of daring priests without any effort. Why do we have to negotiate peace with them? Before Argyll could speak, Earl Lennox, who had always been upright, yelled loudly, and the dissatisfaction in his tone went straight to Edward. No, our interests are different from his. Earl Argyll closed his eyes slightly when he heard the words, and after waiting for a while, he shook his head softly and said, we hope that group of bishops will fall into our hands and wipe them out in one fell swoop. Unlike the English, they need the church to contend with us. After all, everyone knows about his plans for Scotland. The Earl of Argyll was much older than the Earl of Lennox, and knew more about nature. Chapter 321 Disposal. In this way, Our Majesty the King accepted the surrender of the Church of Scotland with a smile on his face, smiling like a child. Brilliantly that night, Our Majesty the King held a grand banquet. This banquet was set up in his own camp, which was safe and gorgeous, and the spacious main tent looked extraordinarily gorgeous. Campbell, what do you think we should do? Pointing to the unique invitation card on the table, the young Earl Lennox stared at Earl Argyle with grey blue eyes and asked. The Earl of Argyle's name is Archibald Campbell. Generally speaking, only close people can be called by the first name, and ordinary friends are called by the last name he. Lennox, don't be angry, take a sip of tea. This was given to me by the King of England. I heard that in England, a pound of tea costs hundreds of pounds. The Earl of Argyle, who was 5 or 6 years older than the Earl of Lennox, looked at him very calmly, with the corners of his mouth slightly raised, and said in a relaxed tone while talking in his mouth. He continued to soak in hot water step by step according to the more and more movements, and suddenly, a faint tea fragrance overflowed. Earl Argyle sniffed his nose, with an expression of enjoyment on his face. Earl Lennox, who was on the side, turned his eyes to him, and glanced at the cup soaked with leaves. His Excellency the Earl immediately felt sick. What good is the leaf to drink, Campbell? It's not that I'm grumpy. But this Edward is too much. Upon hearing Earl Argyle's words, Earl Lennox approached him. After speaking, he picked up a cup of tea on the table with his right hand, and carefully observed the porcelain cup with blue stripes on the surface, without taking his eyes off it. Hey, Earl Argyle reminded him softly, and after he finally turned his gaze away, Earl Argyle said with a smug tone, my father bought these teacups from the group of Venetian merchants. I heard that it took at least 300 gold coins to snatch them from a group of nobles. They are very precious. The short beard on Earl Argyle's lips trembled slightly, squinting his eyes, and said in a trembling voice. It seemed that he cherished this opportunity to show his family's historical origin, and he felt much better. Please, this is not the time to show off your family background. Earl Lennox showed admiration and exaggerated expressions on his face at the right time, which made Earl Argyle feel more comfortable, but his inner voice was quite different. My Lord Earl, I can't learn your leisurely mood. The duck flew away. As the commander of the army, don't you know our situation? Earl Lennox was young and energetic, and there was a hint of scolding in his words, and the loud voice made the guards tremble a little. I saw him blushing, with wide eyes, staring closely at Earl Argyle, eyes full of anger. Of course Earl Argyle knew that although it was Earl Lennox who was complaining alone at the moment, there were other nobles, big and small, behind him as the leader of the coalition of nobles and the candidate for regent after Earl Allen. These responsibilities rest on him. Count, I know you are very angry, but for now, there is nothing we can do about it. Young king. Earl Argyle took a sip of hot tea leisurely, with a helpless look on his face, and directly choked. Earl Lennox, didn't I know that after those scoundrels from the church surrendered to that Edward, the gold coins in our mouths would fly? Earl Argyle immediately became serious, put down the teacup in his hand, and explained. Now, the original army of more than 20,000 people has killed more than 5,000 people in the battle with the church a while ago, and the number of casualties this time has also reached 3,000. In other words, we only have 12,000 people, but how many people does that Edward have? If you add the group of defeated generals, it's about 15,000. Earl Lennox thought for a moment before blurting out the words, that's it. His strength can already crush us. Now, instead of worrying about how to recover the loss, let's think about how to reduce the loss and the next time. Finally, Earl Argyle sighed and said sadly. Hearing this, Earl Lennox certainly knew what was going on. The union of the previous period has ended, and now it is time for conflicts between them and the English former teammate England. After this war, their strength has not decreased but increased, but their strength has been greatly damaged in this way. The original partners turned into hungry wolves, and began to prepare to devour their flesh when they were injured. Okay, let's prepare. Tonight's banquet, I think, is not that simple. After wasting his saliva for a while, Earl Argyle sighed slightly when he saw Earl Lennox's sudden realization, patted his shoulder, and began to sip tea on his own. Looking at the somewhat disappointed Earl Argyle, Earl Lennox gave him a meaningful look before walking out. In the evening, all the soldiers in the camp of the English army stared intently at all the people who came in and out, not letting go of any suspicious people. Although the banquet was reported in the main account, the soldiers in England could not rest for a while. Instead, they were required to strictly observe military discipline and not relax. Therefore, Earl Lennox was wearing gorgeous noble clothes and came to the camp in a carriage. This is what he saw. The soldiers raised their heads and opened their eyes wide, as if they wanted to see through people. giving people an inexplicable sense of uneasiness. Ignoring the low-level nobles who wanted to strike up a conversation with him, Earl Lennox walked towards the brightly lit main tent on his own. The banquet is the same as usual. The tables are arranged randomly, and the seats are not marked, basically just sitting at will. However, in this world, there are still so-called default rules. As one of the few great nobles in Scotland, who controls the great nobles of Scotland, his position has always been at the top, next to the young king. In other words, they were at the same long table with the young king on the way to their own seats. The nobles who were invited saluted intermittently to His Excellency the Earl. His Excellency the Earl was exhausted and his facial muscles were a little stiff. His Excellency the Earl naturally sat beside Earl Argyle, and then glanced casually around. Immediately, a thin old man with grey hair and beard and wearing a grey robe sat there peacefully, narrowing his eyes, as if he didn't care about the surrounding situation. Sorry, I broke my promise again. It's Calvin today. The map of Scotland is coming to an end. I'm thinking about how to end it. Anyway, these 2 updates will definitely be sent out. Chapter 322 Disposal. Seeing his peaceful appearance and his position, Earl Lennox's brain spun rapidly. Finally knowing his identity, Malenka Blanche, Earl Lennox murmured subconsciously, his grey blue eyes dilated slightly. What? Are you talking about him? Earl Argyle, who was sitting at the side, gave him a strange look, and then followed his gaze before asking, I think Malenka Blanche is the leader of the surrender of the church. No wonder you are surprised. Earl Argyle glanced at Blanche calmly, and then spoke to Earl Lennox very calmly. Seeing that there was no anger, don't look any further, this old man must have been bribed. The King of England has a good trick. After Earl Argyle approached Earl Lennox a little distance away, he sighed in his ear. However, right now, the most important thing is to concentrate and hold your breath. I think this young king will definitely make a move. We must be prepared. After speaking, Earl Argyle's face was full of smiles again, looking extremely elegant. In the following time, the 2 of them did not continue talking. Instead, they got up from time to time to wave and talk with those nobles who were close to each other. Communication was inevitable after the nobles and priests arrived one after another. The soldiers of 5 big and 3 rough took the dishes with concentration and held their breath, and began to serve one after another. Of course, in the barracks, the conditions are still a bit rough. However, a large-scale market has also been established on the left side of the army. There are hundreds of merchants accompanying the army, and there are still some basic materials. Spices are too expensive, and Edward is reluctant to part with them. Moreover, the merchants don't have so many reserves to supply. There are no spices in this banquet, which makes these nobles who have enjoyed it regrettable. However, there are still barbecues and steamed fruits, together with some soft bread and alcoholic drinks. It is enough to entertain these bitter Scottish nobles. For the nobles, the biggest disadvantage is that the beautiful and lovely ladies come to participate. For the nobles, the attractiveness of the banquet without the ladies is greatly reduced. So, at the last moment when Edward came in, he found that the bishops of the church were full of energy, with expectations on their faces. As for the nobles with the largest number, their disappointment was palpable, and they couldn't lift their spirits. By the grace of God, His Majesty Edward VI, King of England, France, Ireland, and Scotland, defender of the faith, God's vicar on earth, head of the Church of England and Ireland, too. The guard walked in first, then looked at the nobles and bishops with piercing eyes, and shouted loudly, His Majesty. No matter the nobles or the bishops, they bowed and saluted one by one, restrained the expressions on their faces, and showed reverent expressions one after another. All of them were acting school. Everyone, please sit down. Edward looked around among the nobles, especially the Earls of Argyle and Lennox, as well as Bishop David Beaton. The eyes of these 3 stayed the longest. Walking slowly to his place, sat down gently and gracefully, with a smile on his face, nodded, and said the nobles and the bishop thanked in unison, and finally, the banquet began. Foie gras, venison leg, roasted chicken, roasted lamb, roasted pear, boiled apple, plus crispy bread with honey. These foods were placed in front of Edward's eyes, which greatly reduced the appetite of the king. He has been tired of eating these things for a while now, and now his appetite is greatly reduced when he sees them, and now he only wants to eat vegetables in his mind. But he still had to pretend to be happy and chatted with the nobles. Present Mr. Earl. You should know this, Bishop Blanche. In Europe during this period, the so-called eating was the same as our usual way of chatting, and there was no quiet situation during eating like in the future. Therefore, Edward didn't have to worry about being impolite. He opened his lips and introduced Bishop Blanche with white hair and beard with a smile. Of course, Your Majesty. Earl Argyle raised his beard and said lightly, With an inexplicable smile on his face, Bishop Blanche is a well-known figure in Scotland. His Majesty the Pope personally received him, and even called him the most devout believer in the Scottish Church. How could I have never seen him? The two of them talked about Bishop Blanche, and at the same time, His Excellency the Bishop opened his eyes and looked here. Since that's the case, then I don't need to say more. Edward turned his head, looked at Bishop Blanche, looked at his grey hair and age spots on his face, and said kindly, "This time, thanks to your Excellency the Bishop, otherwise how long would it take for this war to end? Seeing this, I would like to thank him for his contribution to the peace of Scotland. On behalf of all the people of Scotland, I would like to toast him." With that said, Edward stood up, held up a glass of wine, looked around, looked happy, and finally said to Bishop Blanche. Bishop Blanche didn't expect him to do this again, and was stunned for a moment. Not only him, but several senior nobles beside him also stared at the wine glass in his hand, as if time stopped at this moment. How shameless. Many people cursed in unison, but there was still a smile on their faces in the blink of an eye. His Majesty the King, who immediately became a representative of the people and represented the opinions of the entire Scottish public, certainly knew what these people were thinking. Our king didn't take it seriously at all. Instead, seeing these people aggrieved and wanting to speak but not daring to speak made him even happier. "Your Majesty, it is my honor." Bishop Blanche reacted the fastest, put away the astonishment on his face, and instantly changed into a moved face, bending even lower under Edward's gaze. Blanche drank the wine in the glass in one gulp, looking extremely happy. "Very good, Your Excellency." Edward followed suit, with a brighter smile on his face. After Edward finished speaking, Bishop Blanche knew that this meant that His Majesty the King had truly recognized him. Afterwards, Edward sat down, and he turned his gaze to the Earl of Argyll. "Your Excellency, the current peace in Scotland is hard-won. We must cherish it. What do you think?" Seeing His Majesty's compassionate expression, Earl Argyll suddenly felt like he had eaten shit, but he wanted to say it but couldn't. The meaning of this sentence. Of course, Earl Argyll knew that it was the king who forced him to agree to peaceful coexistence with the church and end the state of war. Chapter 323 Disposal. In the end, our Lord Earl nodded in agreement in desperation, and the atmosphere of the whole banquet suddenly condensed in an instant. There was nothing wrong with the priests. They ate and drank as usual, as if they hadn't heard anything. Their expressions remained the same, but the nobles were different: stunned, surprised, even angry, and so on. It's no wonder that apart from the Earl of Arran, who is far away in Edinburgh, the current Earl of Argyll is the best representative of the nobility, and he needs to pay attention to his words and deeds. But fortunately, most people knew what kind of place this was, and they were suffocating. As for those who had a bad temper, they had already been pressed down by their companions. A young nobleman at the corner just wanted to stand up, but a friend beside him held him down, making him unable to break free. Patience. Looking back, the friend had an anxious look on his face. "Don't you know? Last year, a fool was impulsively killed and buried alive. I don't want to attend your funeral." As he spoke, he seemed to think of the unlucky ghost who was buried alive last year, and his face suddenly turned pale. Hearing what his friend said, the complexion on the nobleman's face was beyond words, and he could only sit down silently in desperation. Turning around, Earl Argyll had a solemn expression on his face and lowered eyelids, as if he was thinking about something. But Edward still looked at it with a smile, as if waiting for the good news. But, as time went by, his smile became colder and colder. Of course our Lord Earl knew this. The moment Edward's face turned cold, he raised his head with a bright smile. "Of course, my lord," Earl Argyll said respectfully, leaning slightly. "You are not only the King of Scotland, but also the representative of the world. It is our duty to obey your orders." Although Earl Argyll's flattery was very low, Edward nodded with satisfaction and smiled happily when he heard it in Edward's ears. "Since everyone hopes for peace so much, from today onwards, there will be no more wars in Scotland. May the Lord bless Scotland." There was a hint of a smile in Edward's eyes, and then he cast his eyes very forcefully on the rest of the nobles sitting upright, and blessed loudly, "May the Lord bless Scotland." The nobles and bishops also stood up in unison, bowing their heads and praying loudly. The nobles of Scotland have finally accepted the reality, Edward thought with relief. Next, even though Edward took the Earl of Argyll, the Earl of Lennox, Archbishop David Beaton, and Bishop Blanche out to discuss matters, the atmosphere in the hall was still silent, too quiet here. Edward came to another small tent with representatives of the nobles and the church, and started a discussion. Which was a discussion that would determine the next 10 years of Scotland. "Your Excellency, since you have agreed to shake hands with the church and ask for peace, then just say what you want, Edward was the first to sit on the main seat, and then glanced at everyone who followed, and finally set his sights on Earl Argyll. "Your Majesty, although we are willing to reconcile with the Church, we have already spent a lot of money and material resources in order to protect the faith of our Lord, and we need the Church to make up for it one by one." Earl Argyll glanced at Edward lightly, and then immediately turned his gaze to Bishop Blanche, who looked radiant. "Your Excellency, what is the condition?" This, Bishop Blanche glanced at Edward on the main seat first, and then said decisively after seeing him blink slightly, "Of course, these are our faults, and we should pay for them." Hearing this, Earl Argyll had a hint of joy on his face, waiting for the second half of his sentence. "However, we can offer up to £10,000 as compensation. The recent war has exhausted our savings. This is the only money we have left." As he said that, Bishop Blanche showed a bitter smile, as much aggrieved as he wanted. The faces of the Earl of Argyll, the Earl of Lennox, and Bishop Eaton immediately turned blue, which was extremely ugly. "My Lord Bishop, your sincerity makes me unacceptable." When Argyll heard such a small number, his heart was immediately filled with anger. Just his own family, because of this war, has consumed close to £5,000. This does not include the manpower summoned. The church property that was swallowed up has been completely vomited out, and a lot of losses have been paid. Seeing this, Edward interjected very calmly, "Your Excellency, if you don't have any gold coins, then let them sell some religious assets." "Yes, Your Majesty." Bishop Blanche agreed with some grievances. "Then, transfer the 3 floors of the teaching property to the nobles as compensation, and I will get the other 3 floors, and you can keep the remaining 4 floors." Edward pretended to think about it, and then said loudly. The nobleman on the side gritted his teeth with hatred, but he still had a calm look on his face. No wonder they were like this. In the agreement between Edward and them last year, the 7th floor belonged to them, and the 3rd floor belonged to the king. But this time, the 7th floor became 3 floors, and the remaining 4 floors were still in the hands of the church. Although they had seized some land before, these 3 floors still could not satisfy them. Next, several nobles and Bishop Blanche made a detailed division of the 3 tiers of religious property, including land and shops. After that, Edward made the following agreement with the 3 nobles and a bishop. Article 1. All the nobles of Scotland and the people of Scotland unconditionally accept the descendants of His Majesty Edward VI and Mary as heirs to the throne, and pledge allegiance to their designated heirs to the throne. This is to reaffirm the royal succession, as well as Edward's own legal rights. Second article. Your Majesty Edward and Mary have the power to appoint bishops throughout Scotland, and shall not accept orders from Rome or anyone else. This article is to take the religious power of various places back into the royal power and strengthen the control over the church. Third, any case involving an amount of 10 shillings or more must be submitted to the royal court established by His Majesty the King for trial, and no one may interfere or obstruct. This article is to follow the example of Henry VIII, starting with the judiciary, gradually transferring the rights in the hands of the nobles, and making it easier to accept. Fourth, Scotland will no longer accept any teachings and metaphors from Rome, and will fully support the teachings of Anglicanism, return to the true embrace of our Lord, and determine His Majesty Edward and His Majesty Mary as the only leaders, extending to other heir. Fifth, any person or organization against the royal family shall not appear in Scotland, and those who violate it will be charged with treason. Sixth, nobles, churches, and even individuals are not allowed to have private soldiers exceeding the following regulations, and noble private soldiers are not allowed to own flames and crossbows. Violators will be punished with treason. Earl, 500 men, viscount, 300 people barons, 200 jazz, cavaliers, less than 100 players individual, less than 50 people. Scotland's standards are much happier and more relaxed than those of England's nobles, and the nobles hesitated for a while before agreeing. The main reason is that they usually don't have that much money to maintain these regulations. Number 7th, Scotland establishes a national army. The army personnel come from various nobles. Each noble needs to hand over half of his private soldiers to the country, and the leader is the King of Scotland. The military expenditure only needs to be half-eighth. All nobles should and must live in London for 6 months and attend 4 meetings of the House of Lords. If the standards are not met, they will be fined, and if they are serious, their titles will be reduced. 9th, Scottish nobles only need to pay half of the tax of ordinary people, but they must be loyal to His Majesty the King. 10th, Scottish merchants enjoy the same standards as ordinary Englishmen for their goods entering and leaving England without paying customs duties. 11th, Scotland no longer uses Latin, but English. 12th, Scotland no longer adopts its own currency and weights and measures, but adopts the same standards as England. 13th, No one in Scotland may insult His Majesty the King, or damage the reputation of the King, and offenders shall be punished accordingly. 14th. The Scottish nobles should follow the tradition, obey the King's orders when they should, and dispatch the necessary troops to follow and help. 15th. Any nobleman must go to the Bureau of Heralds to register. Noblemen who have not registered will not be recognized. A total of 25 items. These are the pillars, or the framework, of Edward's control of Scotland. In a few years, there will be no mistakes. Chapter 324 Harvest. Generally speaking, these regulations of Edward are still somewhat binding on Scotland. For example, the limit on private soldiers, although the number is stipulated, but the standard is similar to the number of ordinary nobles, and even more than similar ranking nobles, which has expanded a lot. However, there are more private soldiers on the surface, but half of the private soldiers must be contributed to join the newly established Scottish army, which indirectly weakens the strength of the nobles, and makes it less uncomfortable for the nobles to accept. In fact, this bill is to follow the example of his grandfather, His Majesty Henry VIII, the monarch who founded the Tudor dynasty. It can be said that he established the strong position of the later monarchs, just like China's Song Tzu Kuogayan established the Song dynasty. Same situation in the following judicial aspects. We also learned from Henry VIII with 10 shillings as the starting point, all cases on it will be heard by the royal court, and the nobles must not refuse or obstruct it. This means that slightly larger civil or criminal cases are basically stripped from the hands of the nobles, and the royal family has seized the most important judicial part from the hands of the nobles, laying the foundation for the subsequent comprehensive seizure of justice. Stipulating that nobility must be certified by the Bureau of Heraldry is just repeating the same old tune, continuing to emphasize the power of the king and the king's nominal dominance over the nobility. However, what Edward values most is the 8th article, so the nobles must stay in London for the first half of the year and must attend 4 meetings of the House of Lords. This means that the Scottish nobles will spend half of their time in London every year, and the economic city of London, if political factors are added, will soon become the largest city in Europe, and the Scottish nobles often stay in London. Then Edinburgh's role as the political centre of Scotland will gradually weaken, and the entire British Isle will have only one political centre. London, and the prosperous and comfortable London, is much better than the cold and boring north of Scotland. It won't be long before the nobles are tired from travelling back and forth and live in comfortable London, and they must live in London. And without the nobility of Scotland, coupled with the spiritual brainwashing of the Anglican sect, the chances of Scotland's rebellion are slim. Of course, Edward also learned from His Majesty King Henry, who unified Scotland's official language and style into English, and also abandoned the original weights and measures. Scotland's coinage rights have been in the hands of the royal family since King David I of Scotland, so Edward was not clearly listed in the treaty. He only needs to change the mint directly to the British pound model in the name of the King of Scotland. In other words, in this operation, although Her Majesty the King still delegated administrative power to the Scottish nobles, he still obtained a lot of rights: take control of the Church of Scotland, obtain half of the judicial power, limit the rights of the nobles, obtain the command of the Scottish army, not to mention the navy, it has been incorporated into the English navy, and restrain the nobles in London, establishing London as the political centre of Britain. If you add last year's foreign affairs, taxation, and some legislative powers, it can be said that the current Scotland is only equivalent to a relatively large autonomous region. In a few decades, it is basically impossible to break away from the rule of England, and Edward has cut so many benefits from the nobles, so he must be compensated. Therefore, Scottish caravans are allowed to come to England for trade, and they are exempted from customs duties, and only half of the final tax needs to be paid. Scotland. Only in this way, Edward can declare that he is the most powerful king in the history of Scotland. Happy times are always unforgettable. After staying in Scotland for nearly a month, Edward is finally ready to go home. He was not in vain this month. First, he confirmed the appointment of the chief bishop of the Scottish diocese, and then urged the nobles in Scotland to prepare to go to London, and then divided the gold coins and valuable church property of the Scottish Church. Of course, as the King of Scotland, Edward also used his and Mary's names to reappoint and screen the heads of the royal territories. After harvesting the church property, the entire royal family has already owned a layer of land in Scotland, crowding out the church and becoming the largest landowner in Scotland. Moreover, as the leader of the newly established Scottish army left behind, he also urged the nobles to recruit private soldiers to form the Scottish army in 1 month. The Scottish army with approximately 2,600 people was established, and Edward selected Viscount Smith and Major Deo, Baron Huntington from France, as the commanders of the army. So, When I came, it was the cold spring in March, and when I went back, it was already early summer with a hint of heat, but the only constant is the intermittent rain. On the way Edward was sitting in the carriage, the blankets were a little damp, not to mention the hard-working soldiers' colds, rotten feet, and unacceptable vomiting and diarrhea. These are unimaginable for German mercenaries, of course. These were also forgotten by Edward for a while. However, fortunately, ginger is very convenient to transport from the east. He has planted it on a large scale, and he will basically carry it with him on long-distance marches. Therefore, in order to take care of this group of wounded, Edward stopped and went, let the sick drink ginger and brown sugar water, and often heated hot water to wash their feet. In this way, the disease was controlled, but hundreds of people died. However, this made Edward win a lot of hearts. Brown sugar and ginger are very valuable, plus they stopped deliberately on the road and found a place for them to recuperate. Most of the mercenaries were very moved. When Edward offered 20 acres of land per person as the cost of 10 years of employment, more than 4,300 mercenaries of more than 5,000 people remained, basically reaching the level of Edward. Expectations in mind, it took half a month to return to London, the largest city in England, together with those noble families. This time, Edward did not return to London directly, and invited the nobles to his Hampton palace to settle down. Her Majesty the King was lying in his own bedroom with his eyes closed, listening to the beautiful girl Luna. Your Majesty, the Church of Scotland is indeed very rich, and you have done a good deal in this expedition. Luna sat down next to Edward, her tender hands gently massaging Edward's shoulders, and her delicate voice gently tickled Edward's heart. There are 500,000 acres of good land alone, more than 20,000 serfs, more than 10,000 oil paintings and sculptures, about 1 million pounds of gold coins from different eras, and countless silver coins. Chapter 325 Ripples. Sure enough, the church is the richest in this era. Edward had a calm look on his face, but he sighed in his heart unexpectedly. In that poor place in Scotland, the church still has so much money, even richer than the Scottish royal family. Sure enough, robbing is really a good way to get rich, and I need to learn it often in the future. Thinking of this, Edward suddenly diverged his thinking that when he ruled France, the wealthy France must have raised a group of fat-headed and big-eared blood-sucking worms, and it must be delicious to eat meat. After removing the levy fee, the entire royal family has become more abundant than ever before. Luna didn't know what His Majesty the King was thinking. Anyway, she felt very happy. In the past few years, every time she came back from the war, the royal family's deficit was always made up. At this moment, she was still thinking about how many times this kind of war would happen again. If Edward knew the fantasy of the little maid, he would definitely give him a wry smile, and even reward him with a big chestnut. To put it simply, you must know that in the era of Henry VIII, successive years of wars have reduced the wealth collected from the Church of England by more than half. I am afraid that this wealth war will be rare in the future. Okay, I don't want to know about this war anymore. I just want to have a good rest. Edward closed his eyes and shook his head from side to side, looking uncomfortable. Luna showed a shallow smile, and the movements of her hands became softer and softer. Her emerald green eyes looked at Edward amusedly, and with hot breath in her mouth, she whispered softly in the young king's ear, "Your Majesty, the Speaker of the Privy Council, His Excellency Alexander, has already asked to see him in the hall. He has been waiting for a long time. You are always embarrassed not to see him." The girl's fragrance and heat made Edward's restless heart even more restless, and her right hand unknowingly climbed onto the girl's plump thigh. "Your Majesty," the girl trailed a trembling ending in her voice, with a hint of peach color on her tender face. She gave him an angry glance, gave Edward a beautiful and mischievous white eye, raised her red lips, and blamed him. "I've been waiting for a long time. You're still playing tricks here. Get up." The girl's anger didn't dispel Edward's hotness, but made the anger in his heart grow stronger. Edward pressed down on the girl's little hut forcefully with both hands, and stretched his body upwards immediately. The girl's slippery red lips began to meet Edward's lips in front of the eyes. The girl's emerald green pupils rolled round and round, full of surprise, as if she couldn't believe the scene. But Edward couldn't see the gleam of joy hidden underneath. But the girl struggled feebly with her hands, still clearly hinting to Edward. Seeing this, our young king certainly understood the hint, and was overjoyed. He stuck out his tongue decisively and pried open some unresponsive teeth. Then, the girl's pink and tender tongue dodged left and right, as if she didn't want the young king to succeed at this time. The young king was very persevering. He endured patience, and caught it step by step, and finally he reaped it just like that, like sucking on ice cream. Edward sucked greedily until he had trouble breathing. At this time, Edward let go of the girl gently, and a thin transparent line was connected between their lips, which was cut off as the distance widened. At this time, the girl's face was covered with a layer of drunken red clouds. She lowered her head shyly, sneaking a sneak peek at Edward from time to time. Like a frightened rabbit at this time, she abandoned her usual independence and boldness. Cute little girl, I'll go see Mr. Speaker first. Let's try again next time. Edward lifted the girl's chin teasingly, said playfully, and stepped forward with ease, looking at the back of the young king. The girl slowly opened the corners of her mouth, like a blooming flower, very charming. When Edward came to the reception hall, His Excellency Fairess Alexander, with thinning hair, had been sitting there waiting for a long time. Hearing the sound of footsteps, Your Excellency, the speaker looked up to see His Majesty the King in Chinese clothes. He immediately stood up, bent down, and greeted respectfully, His Majesty, and, Mr. Speaker, there is no need to be polite, let's talk here today. The air here is better. With a faint smile on Edward's face, he pressed his right hand forward to stop him from saluting. It's been a long time since I saw you. I still miss you a little bit. It is an honor for me and my family to be cared by you. His Excellency Fairess looked at Edward with a moved face, deeply moved, and said it solemnly. For a politician with such a talent for acting, Edward must of course cooperate. As a result, the entire hall was immediately filled with harmonious images of the monarch and his subjects, which made people extremely moved. My Mr. Speaker, I don't know what you want to see me today. After recounting the past, Edward lay lazily on the seat and asked, Your Majesty, the 200 people in London have been in East England for almost 4 months, and I want to report to you. Fairess looked at the young face of His Majesty the King without hesitation, and said unhurriedly, with a gentle and forceful tone, Then tell me, I want to see how those young guys are doing. Edward is quite interested in this matter. This is his New Deal measure, and it is impossible not to pay attention to it. The original 286 officers from London have fully arrived in the 6 counties of East England, and have basically started to carry out reforms as agreed. Among them, 150 people became the head of the 100 household district, and 136 people entered the county government, except for the 39 who were bribed and stopped carrying out reforms, and the 64 who were dereliction of duty because they were reported by the county for corruption. Everyone else has done a good job. Fairess took a document out of his pocket, paused, and then a string of numbers came out of his mouth. Edward estimated that about half of the people were wiped out. And the elimination rate was really high. However, only those who have been refined are the real talents. Besides, Edward estimated that there will be fewer and fewer left, and in the end there will be about 10 left, so he secretly smiled. With their cooperation and urging, the 6 counties of East England have completed basic reforms and fulfilled our requirements. It's just that the families in those counties still occupy a large number of high-level positions in the county. It won't change in a few years. Edward frowned when he heard this, and then opened it again. It would be hell if it could take effect quickly. He has been able to wait these few years, and he is only 14 years old. The end of the 2nd volume. The 2nd volume is over. The Great Colonization, the time of the Great Voyage is coming. It is the first time to write, so it is not surprising that the writing is not good. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.